The heavy wooden gavel struck the mahogany block, its dry resonance filling the sterile air of the Wichita County Courthouse. My father, Thomas Harrell, adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke suit. A tight, victorious smile settled on his face. He leaned back in his leather chair, convinced the ink drying on the proxy document had just legally erased my autonomy. He believed he now held the keys to my grandmother's legacy. He did not know his signature had just initiated a federal indictment. I sat across the aisle, folded my hands in my lap, and smiled back. There is a unique kind of silence that falls over a room when the people who raised you stop seeing you as a human being and start calculating your liquidation value. Welcome to Linda Vengeance, where we expose the truth about families who treat their own blood like a bank account. If you have ever been the scapegoat for a golden sibling, drop your age in the comments right now. You are going to want to hear exactly how this courtroom trap snapped shut on the people who built it. To understand how a father attempts to bankrupt his own daughter, you have to rewind the ledger 6 months. The starting gun fired on the Sunday evening in early October. The Harrell estate, an imposing colonial property nestled in Wichita's most exclusive suburb, smelled of roasted beef and expensive pine polish. We were performing the weekly ritual of the Midwestern family dinner. The silver clinked against bone china. The conversation hovered around weather patterns and country club renovations. It was a flawless performance of domestic bliss, masking a balance sheet dripping in red ink. As a supply chain auditor for a global agricultural firm, my daily operations involve dissecting financial statements, identifying structural optimization failures, and neutralizing liabilities. I apply those exact protocols to my family. My brother Preston sat across from me, ignoring his untouched plate. He tapped the screen of his phone with a rapid, erratic rhythm. Preston operated an ag-tech drone startup that produced glossy pitch decks and zero revenue. He was the golden heir, the visionary, requiring constant financial nourishment to sustain his illusion of success. Thomas set his wineglass down. The polite chatter ceased. The ambient noise of the dining room seemed to evaporate, leaving a heavy, pressurized quiet. He adopted the firm, paternal posture he utilized to close commercial real estate deals. He folded his hands, resting his elbows on the imported mahogany table. Preston is on the verge of a market breakthrough. Thomas said, his tone smooth and practiced. But the global supply chain disruptions have created a temporary cash flow gap. We are securing a short-term bridge loan to push the manufacturing phase forward. He reached into his breast pocket, produced a silver pen, and slid a dense blue-bound contract across the table. The pages hissed against the polished wood. The signature flag rested inches from my plate, right next to my water glass. The underwriters just need a secondary guarantor to release the capital. Thomas continued, framing the demand as a trivial, bureaucratic hoop. It is a mere formality. Family protects family, Dulcie. I looked down at the document. A quick visual audit of the visible clauses revealed a crippling interest rate and predatory default penalties. The fine print contained cross-collateralization terms that would attach to any future earnings I generated. It was toxic debt wrapped in a blue folder. I did not reach for the pen. I kept my hands resting lightly on the tablecloth and met my father's expectant gaze. "I cannot authorize this," I said. My voice remained flat and conversational, stripped of any emotional inflection. My firm enforces strict debt-to-income compliance protocols for all senior auditing staff. Attaching my Social Security number to a high-risk venture flags my personal portfolio with the Internal Risk Management Division. My hands are tied. The polite atmosphere shattered. The warmth vanished from my father's eyes, replaced by a cold, calculating resentment. A muscle near his jaw twitched, beating a frantic rhythm under his skin. My mother, Patricia, gripped the edge of the table. Her knuckles turned stark white against the dark wood. She opened her mouth to deploy a guilt trip, but Preston moved first. Preston pushed his chair back. The wooden legs shrieked against the hardwood floor, a sharp, agonizing sound. "You have millions sitting dormant in a dead trust, and you will not even sign a piece of paper to help me build a legacy," he snapped. A thin sheen of sweat coated his forehead, betraying the panic beneath his anger. He threw his linen napkin onto his plate, overturning his water glass, and stormed out of the dining room. I watched the water pool around the toxic contract. I did not offer an apology or defend my position. Arguing with a bad investment only validates its existence. I stood up, thanked my mother for the meal, and walked out the front door. The Kansas night air felt sharp and clarifying against my skin, biting through my thin coat. I slid behind the wheel of my sedan and started the engine, relieved to escape the theater. 2 miles down the road, the screen of my phone illuminated on the passenger seat. A distinct chime signaled an automated notification cutting through the quiet hum of the heater. I pulled onto the shoulder, put the car in park, and opened the message. It was a localized alert from the credit monitoring service attached to my grandmother's legacy trust. The text on the screen was brief, but the implications were staggering. Someone had just requested a hard credit inquiry using my exact Social Security number and date of birth. I stared at the glowing digits in the dark cabin of my car. The puzzle pieces locked together with sickening precision. My father knew I would never sign that bridge loan. He knew my corporate compliance excuse would end the conversation. He wanted me to leave the table. The dinner was not a request. It was a distraction. The glowing screen of my phone cast a pale blue light across the interior of my sedan. I sat on the shoulder of the empty Kansas highway, listening to the rhythmic clicking of the hazard indicators. The credit alert demanded an immediate, panicked response. The biological instinct when a parent breaches a financial perimeter is to call them and demand answers. I did not reach for the dial pad. The alert did not trigger panic. It triggered a memory. The scent of aging paper and sharp peppermint filled my mind, pulling me back 18 years. I was 10 years old, sitting in a high-backed leather chair that dwarfed my frame. The heavy oak desk in front of me belonged to my grandmother. She was a woman carved from prairie wind and Depression-era pragmatism. She wore tailored wool slacks and kept a red pen tucked behind her ear. Spread across the polished wood was a printed corporate balance sheet. She tapped a specific line item with her manicured fingernail. "Numbers do not lie, Dulcie," she instructed, her voice steady and demanding. "People will spin narratives. People will weave excuses. But the ledger always reveals the truth. You must learn to read the math before you listen to the words." Her lesson was interrupted by a high-pitched scream echoing down the hallway. My younger brother Preston was engaged in a full-scale meltdown. The noise grew louder as my father carried the thrashing child past the open office door. Preston demanded a motorized miniature car he had seen in a glossy catalog. He kicked his feet, striking my father in the knee. I watched from the quiet sanctuary of the oak desk, waiting for Thomas to correct the behavior. Instead, my father rubbed his temple, let out a defeated sigh, and promised to buy the expensive toy tomorrow. The screaming ceased instantly. Preston smiled, wiping a dry eye. My grandmother did not react to the noise. She simply looked at me and circled a deficit on the paper. "A bad investment rewards bad behavior," she murmured, going back to the numbers. That afternoon solidified my psychological architecture. I learned that the Harrell family did not operate on affection or moral boundaries. They operated on transactional appeasement. Thomas paid for peace, and Preston manufactured chaos to extract capital. I chose the ledger. The ledger was safe. I shifted the car into drive and merged back onto the dark pavement. The drive to my downtown Wichita apartment took 20 minutes. My living space stood in stark contrast to the sprawling colonial estate I had just fled. The walls featured exposed brick. The furniture possessed clean, functional lines. There were no fragile antiques to dust, and no display cases holding unearned participation trophies. I dropped my keys in the ceramic bowl near the door and walked straight to my home office. The room held a custom-built server rack and a sleek glass desk supporting 3 high-resolution monitors. I did not bother to take off my wool coat. The chill from the night air helped maintain my focus. I woke the system, bypassing the standard consumer interfaces and logging directly into my secure, encrypted network portal. In the corporate auditing sector, we are trained to isolate a data breach before addressing the hostile actor. I needed to know the exact shape and size of the weapon my father was constructing. The credit monitoring alert provided the initial breadcrumb. I accessed the detailed report, retrieving the specific inquiry code submitted to the credit bureau. The code belonged to a commercial real estate valuation firm based in Kansas City. A standard residential background check relies on basic algorithms, but a commercial valuation requires a deep dive into deed histories, zoning permits, and unencumbered equity. They were not looking at my credit score to co-sign a simple personal loan. They were hunting for collateral. My fingers moved across the mechanical keyboard with practiced rhythm. I ran a reverse search on the valuation firm, pulling their recent public filings and open client requests in the county database. The query returned a digital receipt. A formal request for a comprehensive land appraisal had been submitted 3 days ago. I opened the attached property manifest. The address listed on the document stopped the breath in my lungs. It was not a suburban lot or a vacant commercial strip. It was the geographic coordinates for 400 acres of prime, windswept agricultural land in the western quadrant of the state. The wind farm. When my grandmother passed away, she executed a surgical strike from beyond the grave. She bypassed Thomas entirely, leaving the deed to the wind farm exclusively in my name. The land housed 20 industrial turbines, generating a continuous, self-sustaining stream of renewable energy revenue. It was a flawless performing asset. She knew my father possessed an insatiable appetite for leveraging property to fund his social vanity. She locked the deed behind my signature to ensure the Harrell lineage retained at least one piece of uncorrupted wealth. Now I stared at a digital requisition form proving Thomas had authorized a commercial appraisal on property he did not own. The requisition listed his personal holding company as the primary client. The architecture of the Sunday dinner suddenly made perfect sense. The toxic bridge loan contract, the performative demand for my signature, Preston storming out of the room. It was all calculated theater. Thomas never expected me to sign the blue-bound folder. He orchestrated the argument to establish a documented record of my refusal. He needed me to reject the loan so he could justify the alternative measure he was already executing behind my back. A commercial appraisal of this magnitude costs thousands of dollars and takes weeks to finalize. Thomas would only authorize that expenditure if he had a guaranteed mechanism to leverage the valuation. He intended to pledge the wind farm as collateral to secure the capital Preston desperately needed. But a bank requires a notarized signature from the legal deed holder to authorize a commercial lien. Thomas knew I would never sign over the turbines. He knew I treated that land as sacred. Therefore, he had to possess a strategy to bypass my legal consent entirely. I leaned closer to the center monitor, my eyes scanning the granular metadata attached to the appraisal request. In network security, the most vital clues hide in the timestamps and the secondary access logs. The primary user was listed as my father's holding company, but a faint digital footprint indicated a secondary party had accessed the valuation files mere hours after they were uploaded to the shared portal. I highlighted the secondary IP address and ran it through a dedicated routing trace. The data packets bounced across local servers before resolving to a static network node located less than 5 miles from my apartment. The domain registry populated on the screen, bringing the hidden threat into sharp, terrifying focus. The IP address belonged to Sterling and Carmichael. I froze, staring at the name of the firm. I had spent enough time auditing regional agricultural supply chains to recognize the major players in the local legal sector. Sterling and Carmichael did not handle real estate transactions. They did not facilitate commercial loans. They were a boutique litigation outfit, possessing a very specific, very dark reputation among the Wichita elite. When a wealthy family possessed an heir who developed a substance addiction, or an elderly patriarch experiencing cognitive decline, they called Sterling and Carmichael. The firm specialized in executing quiet, ironclad conservatorships. They were masters at stripping a citizen of their legal autonomy and transferring their financial rights to a designated guardian. The cold air in my office felt suddenly suffocating. My father was not just planning to forge a signature or bully me into submission. The appraisal, the credit check, the involvement of this specific law firm, they all pointed to a singular, devastating conclusion. Thomas Harrell was laying the groundwork to have the courts declare me mentally incompetent. He intended to steal my legal independence so he could hand my wind farm to his golden son. The ledger was balanced. The motive was clear. The trap was already in motion. The revelation of the conservatorship plot required immediate external intelligence. I needed a variable outside my father's direct control. I needed someone inside the Harrell family ecosystem who possessed the analytical capacity to understand the impending ruin, but lacked the blind loyalty required to sink with the ship. I needed Maya. I sent a brief, encrypted text message at dawn requesting a coffee meeting before business hours. Maya Rossi was Preston's wife. She was also a brilliant African-American corporate strategist who managed mergers and acquisitions for a regional logistics firm based in Kansas City. She possessed a surgical mind that mirrored my own. When Preston brought her into our family 5 years ago, I assumed she would quickly pierce through his empty visionary persona. Instead, he sold her the same fabricated dream he sold his investors. She fell for the polished pitch deck he presented as his life. The meeting location was a sleek, independent roastery in the heart of downtown Wichita. I chose a place far removed from the suburban country clubs my parents frequented. The interior smelled of dark roasted beans and sharp citrus cleaner. The early morning light filtered through the tall front windows, casting long geometric shadows across the polished concrete floor. The ambient noise of the espresso machines provided a reliable acoustic shield against eavesdropping. I secured a corner booth far from the barista station, facing the door. I ordered a black coffee and waited. Maya walked through the glass doors 10 minutes late. Punctuality was usually her religion in the corporate sector. Watching her navigate the crowded cafe, I noticed the microscopic fractures in her flawless composure. Maya always wore tailored wool suits and projected an aura of unshakable competence. She was a woman who commanded boardrooms. Today, her silk blouse carried a faint, uncharacteristic wrinkle near the collar. Her posture lacked its usual imposing rigidity. She scanned the room with darting, anxious eyes before spotting me and sliding into the booth across from my table. She ordered a double espresso from the passing server. When the cup arrived, she wrapped her hands around the small ceramic, seeking warmth despite the mild autumn weather outside. The silence between us felt heavy, loaded with unspoken accusations and shared suspicions. We both understood the unwritten rules of engagement. In our specific social circles, you never stated a financial crisis outright. You approached the topic sideways, using corporate euphemisms and polite inquiries about broader market trends. Maya took a slow sip of her espresso and kept her gaze fixed on the dark liquid. She asked if I had spoken to Thomas recently. Her voice carried a strained, forced casual tone that sounded entirely unnatural coming from her. She mentioned the shifting interest rates and the tightening commercial credit markets. She asked how my auditing firm was handling the recent dip in regional real estate valuations and whether we were seeing an uptick in loan defaults among local agricultural developers. It was a highly calculated probe. She was testing my awareness of the Harrell family balance sheet. She wanted to know if I recognized the precarious nature of my father's holdings without violating her marital discretion. I kept my expression neutral, responding with sterile industry statistics about yield curves and risk management. I did not give her the satisfaction of a direct confirmation. I needed her to break protocol first. I needed her to drop the corporate shield and show me the raw, unedited data. As she spoke, her left hand rested on the wooden table. Her thumb rhythmically rubbed the band of her engagement ring. It was a nervous, frantic tick I had never witnessed her perform before. The ring was a custom Cartier piece Preston proudly showcased during their engagement dinner, boasting loudly about the flawless clarity and the exorbitant cost of the center stone. It was supposed to be a permanent testament to his impending success as a tech founder. The morning sun angled through the cafe window, striking the jewelry directly. My profession requires a meticulous eye for discrepancies. I analyze variance reports and hunt for structural anomalies in complex spreadsheets. I watched the natural light pass through the stone. A genuine diamond possesses a high refractive index, breaking light into sharp, brilliant flashes of distinct white and gray. It bends the illumination with a crisp internal fire. The stone on Maya's finger threw off dull, rainbow-colored prisms, a telltale sign of heavy light dispersion. The math locked into place in my mind. The Cartier Platinum setting was authentic, but the center stone was a synthetic replacement. It was a cheap, cubic zirconia fake. The psychological weight of that dull refraction hit me like a physical blow. Preston had not just made a poor investment or missed a quarterly projection. He had faced a margin call so severe, he pawned his own wife's wedding diamond to cover the deficit. He hollowed out the symbol of their marriage to sustain the illusion of his tech startup. And Maya, the brilliant acquisition strategist, was sitting across from me, wearing the glass replica, pretending the foundation of her life was still intact. I shifted my gaze from her trembling hand up to her eyes. She saw me looking at the ring. The polite Midwestern charade evaporated instantly. The muscles in her jaw tightened, and the sophisticated corporate veneer dissolved, leaving a terrified woman trapped in a rapidly sinking ship. "Preston changed the administrative passwords to our joint operating accounts," Maya whispered. Her voice trembled, carrying a raw, desperate frequency that demanded my full attention. "He locked me out of the primary banking portals 3 weeks ago. I pulled the routing data from a secondary tax form he forgot to shred. He is bleeding capital at an unsustainable rate, Dulcie. The runway is entirely gone. He is pulling exorbitant cash advances on high-yield personal credit lines just to make the minimum payroll for his phantom engineering team." She leaned closer across the small table, dropping her volume to a barely audible register. Her eyes darted toward the cafe door again. "I found encrypted emails between your father and the regional bank president. Thomas is actively trying to leverage the suburban estate to float Preston through the winter. The deficit is not just a temporary cash flow gap like they claimed at dinner. It is a total systemic failure. They are hunting for liquid capital, and they are growing terrified." I absorbed the intelligence without altering my breathing pattern. Maya confirming Thomas' sheer desperation validated my theory regarding the forged conservatorship. They were willing to strip me of my legal autonomy and steal my wind farm because they had exhausted every other legitimate line of credit. They were cornered animals looking for a sacrificial asset. Maya checked her phone resting on the table. A calendar notification flashed across the screen, and her shoulders stiffened. She grabbed her designer trench coat and stood up with abrupt, chaotic energy. The poised strategist was gone, replaced by a woman running out of time and options. "I cannot stay," she said, her voice tight with suppressed panic. "Preston tracks the GPS locator on my vehicle. He thinks I am at the gym across town. If he finds out I spoke to you, he will panic. And a panicked man makes catastrophic, unrecoverable mistakes." She did not wait for my response or offer a formal goodbye. She turned and walked briskly out the glass doors, blending into the morning pedestrian traffic on the sidewalk. I remained in the booth, processing the rapid, terrifying exchange. The coffee in my cup had grown cold. I reached forward to push the empty espresso saucer away to clear the table. Underneath the small white plate lay a folded paper napkin. Maya had slipped it there during her frantic departure, using the saucer to conceal the movement. I picked up the thin paper and unfolded it on the wood. She had written a single string of alphanumeric characters using a black ink pen. It was not a bank routing number or a local court filing code. It was a formal regulatory docket identifier. The prefix letters were unmistakable to anyone operating in the corporate auditing sector. SEC. I stared at the black ink bleeding slightly into the cheap, porous paper. The Securities and Exchange Commission. My brother had not just mismanaged his startup. He had not merely defrauded local Kansas investors or faked a revenue pitch deck. The presence of a federal regulatory docket meant Preston Harrell had crossed the invisible line from gross negligence into actionable corporate fraud. His failures were federal crimes, and my father was actively conspiring to steal my land to fund a criminal defense. I placed the folded paper napkin on the glass surface of my desk. The black ink spelling out the federal regulatory identifier seemed to burn into the transparent material. The letters represented a point of no return. A federal investigation into Preston meant the Harrell family faced an existential threat. My father was not merely trying to secure a bridge loan to cover a rough fiscal quarter. He was scrambling to raise capital to keep his favored son out of a federal penitentiary. The stakes had escalated from simple corporate debt to the preservation of their freedom. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and stared at the napkin. The biological instinct when discovering a betrayal of this magnitude is to confront the perpetrators. A normal daughter might drive back to the suburban estate, pound on the mahogany doors, and demand a full explanation. I did not reach for my car keys. Confrontation is a tactical error. It alerts the enemy that their cover is blown, allowing them to destroy evidence and alter their approach. I needed to shift my mindset entirely. My biological relatives were no longer toxic family members. They were active, hostile threat actors. I needed to fortify my digital perimeter. The wind farm deed was filed with the Kansas County records, but the primary tax portal routed through a legacy server I maintained for personal archiving. Thomas knew about this server. He paid for the original hardware installation years ago when I was a college student. He possessed the arrogant assumption that purchasing the equipment meant he retained inherent ownership of its contents. I used that hubris against him. I accessed the firewall configuration panel on my center monitor. A standard security auditor would raise the barricades and lock the gates. That is a defensive posture. I needed an offensive intelligence gathering mechanism. I intentionally downgraded the encryption protocols on the outer directory. I created a digital tripwire, leaving the back door unlatched just enough to invite an intruder inside, while ensuring the core operating system remained shielded. It was a classic honeypot, designed to catch a predator in the act. The apartment grew silent as the city of Wichita shut down for the night. I sat in my office, bathed in the pale blue light of 3 high-resolution monitors. I drank cold water to keep my senses sharp. Midnight passed. 1 in the morning arrived and faded. 2 o'clock brought nothing but the steady hum of the cooling fans inside my custom server rack. I watched the traffic logs scroll across the left screen in a steady, meaningless stream of automated bot pings and background system updates. The waiting requires a specific type of endurance. At 3:14 in the morning, the primary alert system triggered. A single, sharp chime echoed in the quiet room. The center monitor flashed a stark red warning banner. An unauthorized authentication request was hitting the gateway. I leaned forward, resting my hands on my thighs. I did not touch the keyboard. Intervening would alert the attacker that the system administrator was actively monitoring the session. The raw data cascaded down the screen, displaying a rapid, relentless sequence of login attempts. It was a crude, brute force attack. The hostile software cycled through a dictionary of potential passwords, relying on significant dates, family names, and old childhood addresses. It was the digital equivalent of a burglar kicking a door instead of picking the lock. The origin IP address resolved instantly. The digital footprint traced back to the primary router in the Harrell suburban estate. My father was sitting in his plush home office, hidden behind heavy doors, orchestrating a cyber intrusion against his own daughter in the dead of night. I felt a chilling detachment wash over me. The man who taught me how to ride a bicycle was currently utilizing illicit software to break into my financial archives. He viewed my independence as an obstacle to be dismantled. I knew Thomas possessed a ravenous appetite for untraceable assets. He spent hours lecturing Preston about the utility of decentralized finance during their weekend golf games, believing himself to be a pioneer of modern economics, despite his reliance on outdated business models. I decided to weaponize that specific greed. While his brute force program hammered against the weakened outer firewall, I swiftly coded a diversionary target on an isolated partition. I generated a digital folder and assigned it a highly conspicuous title, utilizing standard cryptocurrency nomenclature. Inside the folder, I compiled a series of dummy files filled with randomized algorithmic noise designed to mimic a high-volume, decentralized wallet. Then, I wrapped the entire partition in military-grade encryption. It was a digital safe containing nothing but air, locked behind an unbreakable combination. I nudged the decoy folder into the compromised directory, placing it directly in his path. The moment his software breached the weakened firewall, he would spot the encrypted wallet. His inherent greed would override his caution. He would assume he had stumbled upon my hidden liquid reserves. I knew exactly how his mind worked. He would download the dummy vault and waste agonizing weeks attempting to crack an unsolvable puzzle. The decoy would anchor his attention, acting as a highly effective red herring. It would buy me the exact operational window I required to secure the actual physical land before he realized he had been played. At 3:28, the relentless assault ceased. The external connection severed. Thomas had taken the bait and retreated, assuming his nighttime raid was a total success. The silence returned to my office, broken only by the mechanical whir of the hard drives processing the event. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the forensic work remained. I needed to know exactly what else he had touched during his brief excursion inside the outer directory. I ran a sweeping diagnostic on the compromised sector, extracting the metadata from every file he accessed. It felt like sweeping a crime scene for fingerprints, identifying the specific objects the intruder deemed valuable. The log displayed the encrypted crypto decoy at the top of his download list, exactly as I planned. But the secondary items chilled the blood in my veins. He had bypassed the raw tax receipts and the agricultural yield projections. He ignored the spreadsheets detailing the wind farm revenue. Instead, he focused entirely on the legal templates stored in a dormant archive folder from my university days. The metadata confirmed he successfully copied two very specific documents. The first was a blank transfer on death deed. It is a legal instrument used to bypass the probate process and instantly reassign property ownership upon the passing of the original title holder. The second document was far more terrifying. It was an emergency medical proxy. I stared at the file names glowing on the screen. The cold air from the ventilation system seemed to penetrate my wool coat. My father was not just hunting for collateral to pledge against a commercial loan. He was gathering the specific legal instruments required to declare me medically unfit. He was preparing the paperwork to strip me of my physical and legal competency so he could sign the wind farm over to himself as my court-appointed guardian. The trap was no longer just a financial maneuver. It was a direct, calculated assault on my freedom. The discovery of the downloaded medical proxy shifted the battlefield from a financial dispute to an imminent physical threat. A forged commercial loan would ruin my credit, but a fabricated medical conservatorship would erase my existence. If my father successfully filed that document with a compliant local judge, he would gain the legal authority to dictate my health care, freeze my bank accounts, and restrict my physical movements. He could legally lock me in a psychiatric facility to ensure I could not contest the transfer of the wind farm. The danger was no longer theoretical. It was a ticking mechanism sitting on his hard drive, waiting for a signature. I did not sleep that night. I packed a single leather overnight bag utilizing the darkness to mask my departure. By 4 a.m, I was driving eastbound on Interstate 70, leaving the Wichita city limits behind. The tires hummed a steady, monotonous rhythm against the cold asphalt. I needed to cross the state line. Remaining inside Kansas meant remaining vulnerable to the local judicial ecosystem my father had spent decades cultivating through golf course handshakes and campaign donations. I required an independent jurisdiction and an ally who operated entirely outside the Harrell sphere of influence. The sun crested the horizon as I navigated the sprawling concrete arteries of Kansas City, Missouri. I pulled into the underground parking garage of a modest, brutalist office building situated in the financial district. The architecture lacked the ostentatious glass and marble columns my father preferred for his corporate ventures. This building projected stoic permanence. It housed the offices of a boutique wealth management and legal fiduciary firm. I rode the elevator to the 7th floor and walked into a quiet reception area. A heavy mahogany door opened, and a tall, striking African-American woman stepped into the lobby. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that commanded absolute authority. Her posture was rigidly straight, projecting an aura of impenetrable competence. This was Valerie. She was a brilliant financial lawyer, an independent fiduciary, and my godmother. More importantly, Valerie possessed a profound, deeply ingrained hatred for my father. 10 years ago, Valerie was the rising star at my father's corporate law firm. She was the junior partner who actually performed the grueling due diligence and structured the complex agricultural mergers, while Thomas spent his afternoons entertaining clients on the fairway. When the firm landed a massive regional logistics account, Valerie did the foundational work. Thomas, recognizing the lucrative potential, orchestrated a ruthless internal coup. He stole her client list, poisoned her reputation among the senior partners, and systematically pushed her out of the practice to claim the total commission for himself. I was gambling my entire net worth on the assumption that a decade of distance had not extinguished her desire for retribution. Valerie led me into her private office. The walls were lined with dense legal volumes, and the air smelled of old paper and bitter espresso. She did not offer a warm embrace or engage in nostalgic small talk. She sat behind her broad desk and studied my face with calculating, dark eyes. She recognized the specific tension carrying in my shoulders. "You did not drive across the state line before dawn to catch up on family gossip, Dulcie," she said. Her voice was a rich, commanding alto that left zero room for ambiguity. What did Thomas do? I opened my briefcase and extracted the printed intrusion logs, placing them flat on her desk. Beside the digital footprint, I laid down the downloaded copies of the blank transfer on death deed and the emergency medical proxy. I did not waste time narrating my emotional state. I presented the raw, audited facts of the conspiracy, outlining the bridge loan, the commercial appraisal on the wind farm, and the impending conservatorship threat. Valerie picked up the medical proxy. Her eyes scanned the legal boilerplate. Her expression remained entirely neutral, but her fingers tightened slightly around the edges of the paper, creating a faint crease. She understood the sheer predatory audacity of the maneuver. "He is preparing to declare you mentally unfit," she stated, setting the document down. "He intends to use the local probate courts to seize guardianship. It is a horrific strategy, but from a purely sociopathic legal standpoint, it is highly effective. He knows the judges in Sedgwick County. He pays their re-election campaign managers. If he files this proxy locally, you will lose the battle before you even step foot inside a courtroom." I sat forward, resting my forearms on the edge of her desk. "That is why I came to Missouri," I replied. "I need you to execute a shadow exfiltration of the asset. We have to move the wind farm out of my direct name and place it somewhere Thomas cannot reach, regardless of which Kansas judge he buys." Valerie leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers together. The request carried monumental weight. Handing over the administrative rights of a multi-million-dollar performing asset requires absolute, blind trust. If she harbored any lingering resentment toward the Harrell bloodline, she could easily structure a contract that trapped my wealth under her own permanent control. It was a staggering risk. I watched her process the calculus. A faint, cold smile touched the corner of her mouth. The prospect of dismantling the man who had derailed her early career offered a powerful incentive. She unclasped her hands and pulled a fresh legal pad toward the center of the desk. "If we establish a standard holding corporation, Thomas can still file an injunction to freeze the shares during a conservatorship hearing," Valerie explained, her tone shifting into a rapid clinical cadence. "State-level entities are vulnerable to local judicial interference. We must bypass the state courts entirely. We are going to place the deed into a blind federal conservation trust." She began diagramming the corporate architecture on the yellow paper. The federal trust operates under strict agricultural and environmental jurisdictions. It places the land under the protection of federal statutes, completely severing your direct taxable ownership, while guaranteeing you the irrevocable rights to the energy revenue. Once the deed drops into that specific federal vault, a local county judge possesses zero authority to claw it back. The asset effectively vanishes from the domestic chessboard. The bureaucratic process requires absolute secrecy, I noted. If he detects the transfer before the ink is dry, he will file an emergency motion to halt the transition. Valerie nodded her pen, moving furiously across the page, outlining the required indemnifications and the airtight legal shielding necessary to blind the transaction from public county records until the clearance date. I will act as the independent trustee. We will route the ownership through a Delaware blind proxy before dropping it into the federal registry. The layer of obfuscation will ensure the county tax portal continues to display your name until the final federal stamp is applied. He will think he is hunting a sitting duck, while the pond is already empty. She stood up and walked over to a heavy filing cabinet, extracting a thick stack of federal registration forms. For the next 3 hours, we operated in total silence, broken only by the sound of pages turning and pens scratching against paper. I signed away my direct ownership, signing away my physical leverage to build an unassailable fortress around my future. It was an exhausting, exhilarating purge of vulnerability. When the final signature was applied, Valerie gathered the documents and walked over to her administrative terminal. She needed to cross-reference the filing codes with the current federal processing queue to establish our operational timeline. She keyed the data into the secure government portal, navigating the dense bureaucratic interface. I watched the reflection of the screen glow against her glasses. Her typing slowed and then stopped entirely. The triumphant energy in the room abruptly evaporated, replaced by a sudden, suffocating tension. Valerie let out a slow, measured breath and turned away from the monitor to face me. "The Federal Conservation Trust provides absolute immunity," she said, her voice dropping an octave, carrying a grim, heavy warning. "But the immunity is not instantaneous." She walked back to the desk and tapped the legal pad. A transfer of this magnitude involving critical energy infrastructure triggers a mandatory federal review period. The statutes require a 21-day holding period for the title to clear the National Registry and become legally unassailable. During those 3 weeks, the asset remains in a vulnerable transitional state. I processed the mathematics of the delay. The red herring cryptocurrency decoy I planted on my server would occupy my father, but it would not hold his attention forever. Worse, the external pressures mounting against him operated on an entirely different timeline. "I ran the commercial lending algorithms through my head," I replied, keeping my voice steady, despite the adrenaline spiking in my chest. If Thomas submitted the fraudulent commercial loan application utilizing the forged appraisal, it will hit the final underwriting desk rapidly. Commercial bridge loans for high-tier clients generally close in exactly 14 days. Valerie looked at me, the stark reality of the numbers settling over the office. "Thomas will attempt to collateralize the wind farm 7 days before your federal shield activates. If the bank finalizes his loan against your deed while our transfer is still suspended in the federal holding queue, the resulting title collision will trigger a massive, multi-jurisdictional legal war. He will realize you are moving the asset, and he will drop the medical proxy on the local courts immediately to freeze everything. We are a week short on the timeline." The 7-day deficit hung in the office like a toxic gas. Valerie stared at the yellow legal pad, tapping the cap of her fountain pen against the mahogany surface. 14 days until the commercial bridge loan closed. 21 days until the federal shield activated. My father was going to legally intercept the wind farm precisely 1 week before the vault door locked. We needed a temporal shortcut. I stood up and paced the length of the room, feeling the soft give of the carpet beneath my boots. "We cannot alter the federal processing queue," I stated. "The bureaucracy is rigid. If we push the application through standard channels, the timing discrepancy will destroy the operation." Valerie did not answer immediately. She stood up, walked to the heavy iron safe in the corner of her office, and spun the combination dial. The metallic clicks echoed in the quiet space. She extracted a thick manila folder bound by a faded red ribbon. I recognized the parchment instantly. It was the original architectural text of my grandmother's will. Your grandmother did not build an empire by leaving her assets vulnerable to procedural delays, Valerie murmured, untying the ribbon. She anticipated Thomas. She watched him bankrupt 3 separate ventures before you were born. She knew his greed was a systemic condition, not a temporary lapse in judgment. She must have built a back door into the foundational architecture of the deed. We spread the brittle documents across the desk. The paper smelled of dust and dry ink. For 2 hours, we hunted through the dense legal boilerplate. My eyes burned from reading the microscopic font. The Kansas City traffic outside the window shifted from early morning commuters to midday congestion. I traced my finger down the margins, searching for a structural anomaly. My grandmother was a master of defensive mechanics. When I was a teenager, she made me read local zoning ordinances before she allowed me to drive her car. She believed survival depended on understanding the rules better than the people trying to exploit them. I scanned a section regarding land use provisions and stopped. My fingernail rested beneath a heavily coded paragraph buried deep inside a subset of agricultural covenants. Look at the agricultural zoning addendum, I directed, sliding the parchment toward Valerie. Section 4, paragraph 9. Valerie adjusted her glasses and read the text. Her posture stiffened. The grim tension carrying in her shoulders vanished, replaced by a sharp, predatory focus. She looked up from the page, her dark eyes shining with sudden, aggressive clarity. It is a conservation easement clause, Valerie whispered. The reverence in her tone was unmistakable. She wove a failsafe directly into the soil rights. I understood the mechanics of corporate auditing, but federal land management fell outside my daily operational scope. I asked her to translate the legal parameters. Valerie tapped the parchment. A standard property transfer takes 3 weeks because the Federal Registry must conduct a comprehensive commercial title search, she explained. But this specific clause mandates that the wind farm must remain designated as protected, sustainable agricultural infrastructure in perpetuity. By voluntarily triggering this easement right now, you are surrendering any future rights to bulldoze the turbines and build commercial real estate. You are prioritizing the environmental utility of the land. She grabbed a fresh sheet of paper and began writing rapidly. Because you are invoking a protected conservation status, the federal government treats the transfer as an ecological priority rather than a commercial transaction. It bypasses the standard commercial queue entirely. The holding period shrinks from 21 days to 48 hours. The mathematics shifted instantly. A 2-day clearance window meant we would beat the bridge loan deadline by nearly 2 weeks. We could lock the vault before my father even scheduled his underwriting meeting. The timeline was no longer our enemy. But the acceleration carries a fatal vulnerability, Valerie warned, setting her pen down. The moment I file this easement, the local county clerk receives an automated notification regarding the zoning shift. It takes 48 hours for the federal shield to finalize. During those 2 days, the asset is highly visible on the public registry. If Thomas or his legal fixers at Sterling and Carmichael monitor the county portal and spot the zoning update, they will know exactly what we are doing. I processed the risk. If they saw the easement, they would instantly connect the dots. They would rush to the local courthouse and file an emergency injunction to freeze the asset in probate before the federal 48-hour window closed. The entire operation required suffocating silence. We had to trust that the red herring cryptocurrency decoy I left on my server was currently occupying all of my father's attention. I had to gamble that his greed for the fake digital wallet would blind him to the actual physical registry. Draft the paperwork, I commanded. My voice held zero hesitation. Execute the easement. Valerie nodded and turned to her terminal to generate the specific federal authorizations. I stood by the window, watching the Missouri River flow sluggishly in the distance. The physical reality of the impending transaction settled over my shoulders. I was about to sign away my direct ownership of a multi-million-dollar performing asset. I was stripping my own name off the deed, hollowing out my net worth to protect it from the man who gave me that name. Valerie printed a stack of documents on heavy stock paper. She aligned the edges meticulously and pushed the pile across the mahogany desk. Yellow signature flags jutted out from the margins, marking the exact locations where my legal autonomy would vanish. I picked up the heavy brass pen resting beside the stack. The metal felt cold against my skin. I did not experience fear. I felt a profound, clarifying liberation. Every stroke of the pen severed another chain linking me to the Harrell family ecosystem. I signed the transfer of administration. I signed the conservation easement. I executed the blind proxy authorization. I watched my personal wealth transition from a tangible, local asset into an untouchable federal ghost. When the final signature was applied, Valerie gathered the pages. She retrieved a heavy steel embosser from her top drawer. She pressed the device over the final authorization, applying the official federal seal. The mechanism closed with a sharp, decisive crunch. The sound marked the official commencement of the 48-hour countdown. The wind farm was now airborne, transitioning into the blind trust. We simply had to survive the next 2 days without making a sound. Valerie locked the embossed documents inside a waterproof, fireproof dispatch bag. The courier picks up the federal manifests at noon, she stated. We are in the window, Dulcie. Maintain your routine. Go to work. Answer your phone. Do not alter your behavior by a single fraction of a degree. You must present the illusion of total compliance. I nodded, reaching for my overnight bag. I planned to drive back to Wichita immediately and show up for my afternoon auditing shift as if I had spent the morning sleeping. Before my hand could grasp the leather handle, the ambient quiet of the office was shattered by a harsh, synthetic vibration. My smartphone, resting face down on the edge of the mahogany desk, buzzed frantically. It was not a standard text message notification. It was a high-priority system alert. I flipped the device over. The screen illuminated, displaying an urgent banner from my primary retail banking institution. I tapped the notification, authenticating my access with a biometric scan. The financial dashboard loaded, but the familiar green digits representing my available balance were gone. In their place sat a stark red error code indicating a localized administrative block. I tapped the account details, forcing the application to display the specific restrictions. The targeted portfolio was the Shared Legacy Savings Account. It was a joint holding established by my parents when I was an infant, ostensibly designed to foster responsible financial habits. In reality, it served as the primary reservoir for my emergency liquid cash. It held the funds I used for daily operations, rent payments, and utility bills. The screen displayed a devastating update. The account status was listed as frozen, pending primary signatory review. The primary signatory was Thomas. I stared at the glowing red text. The air left my lungs in a slow, silent exhale. My father had not discovered the conservation easement. He had not spotted the federal transfer. He was executing a parallel strategy. He was cutting my supply lines. By unilaterally freezing my emergency liquid cash, he was initiating a brutal campaign of financial strangulation. He intended to starve me out of my independence. He wanted to force me to come crawling back to the sprawling suburban estate, begging for access to my own money. He believed manufacturing a personal financial crisis would soften my defenses, making me desperate enough to sign whatever medical proxy or commercial loan he placed in front of me. He was turning the screws, tightening the pressure. The 48-hour wait for the federal shield to activate had just transformed from a quiet waiting game into a grueling test of physical and psychological endurance. The Oakmont Country Club dining room smelled of starched linen and chlorinated water drifting in from the adjacent terrace. Patricia Harrell adjusted the collar of her silk blouse, smoothing an invisible wrinkle. She navigated the maze of round tables with practiced grace, her heels sinking slightly into the thick, patterned carpet. To the casual observer, she projected the image of a serene, affluent matriarch. Beneath the tailored fabric, her pulse carried a frantic rhythm, driven by the ticking clock of her husband's insolvency. She knew the suburban colonial mansion was teetering on the edge of foreclosure. Thomas needed the wind farm collateral to satisfy his commercial lenders. To secure that collateral, they required a compliant Sedgwick County judge to strip their daughter of her legal autonomy. But the judicial system in Wichita did not operate in a vacuum. Judges attended these same luncheons. Their wives sat on the same charity boards. Legal rulings concerning prominent families required a foundation of social consensus. Patricia was here to pour that foundation. She needed to construct a public narrative of tragic mental decline before Thomas filed the formal conservatorship paperwork. Patricia reached her designated table near the floor-to-ceiling windows. 2 women were already seated. Barbara directed the Regional Symphony Committee, while Diane held immense sway over the local historical society. These women functioned as the informal arbiters of neighborhood reality. Whatever narrative they accepted over roasted chicken salad today would become established fact by tomorrow morning. Patricia took her seat, offering a warm, measured smile. She did not launch into her orchestrated campaign immediately. Midwestern social warfare demands a subtle, prolonged deployment. She ordered an iced tea and engaged in perfunctory chatter about autumn galas and recent property tax hikes. She waited for the precise moment to inject the poison. The opportunity arrived when Diane inquired about the Harrell children, asking if Preston was still disrupting the agricultural technology sector. Patricia let out a soft, carefully rehearsed sigh. She lowered her gaze to her crystal glass, tracing the condensation forming on the rim. She allowed a shadow of manufactured sorrow to cross her features, playing the role of a burdened mother enduring a private tragedy. Preston is facing some complex supply chain hurdles, but his resilience is inspiring. Patricia said, her tone carrying a brittle edge of forced optimism. She seamlessly pivoted the spotlight away from her son's catastrophic federal fraud, shifting the focus toward her intended target. My real concern lately revolves around Dulcie. Barbara and Diane leaned forward, their posture shifting. Gossip, disguised as maternal concern, is the primary currency among the elite. Patricia stirred her tea, the ice clinking a delicate rhythm. "I am terrified for her," she whispered, pitching her voice to a confidential register. The pressure at her auditing firm seems to have triggered something dark. She is exhibiting severe paranoid ideation. We try to engage her, but she locks herself in her apartment. She refuses to pay basic utility bills. Thomas actually had to intervene and manage her checking account just to keep her lights on. It was a masterful inversion of the truth. Thomas had unilaterally frozen Dulcie's emergency funds to starve her into submission. Patricia repackaged that act of financial strangulation, portraying it as a desperate rescue mission performed by a loving father. She weaponized Dulcie's forced poverty, using it as tangible evidence of a psychological breakdown. The true cruelty of the luncheon, however, resided in the 4th chair at the table. Dulcie sat directly across from her mother, listening to the character assassination unfold in real time. Patricia had demanded her attendance, framing the lunch as a mandatory family obligation. She brought her daughter into the public arena to serve as a silent exhibit of the fabricated decline. Patricia watched Dulcie closely, searching for a reactive spark. She expected anger. She anticipated a harsh denial or a sudden tearful outburst. A public scene would have perfectly validated the narrative of emotional instability. If Dulcie raised her voice or caused a disruption, Patricia could simply nod at her friends, offering a tragic, sympathetic smile that said, "See what we are dealing with?" Instead, Dulcie offered nothing. The 28-year-old auditor sat in her structured charcoal suit, radiating sterile detachment. She cut her meal into precise mathematical portions. She chewed her food slowly, maintaining a blank, unblinking focus on the terrace outside. She did not defend herself. She did not interrupt the vicious lies. She absorbed the social sabotage with the clinical fascination of a researcher observing a predictable bacterial culture under a microscope. To Barbara and Diane, the profound silence looked like catatonia. They exchanged knowing, sorrowful glances, validating Patricia's claims. They saw a young woman, disconnected from reality, staring blankly while her mother wept for her fading sanity. To Patricia, the silence felt different. It felt unnatural. Her daughter was enduring profound financial isolation and public humiliation, yet she projected the cold, impenetrable armor of a bank vault. Patricia felt a fleeting chill trace the length of her spine. She pushed the sensation away, relying on the arrogant assumption that Dulcie's lack of resistance signaled ultimate defeat. Thomas had cut the supply lines. The prey was merely submitting to the inevitable trap. "It breaks my heart," Patricia continued, reaching across the table to place her manicured hand over Dulcie's motionless fingers. "We are exploring medical intervention. It is the hardest decision a parent can face, but we must prioritize her safety over her independence. She is simply incapable of making rational choices regarding her future or her assets." Dulcie did not pull her hand away. She allowed her mother to maintain the physical contact, preserving the illusion of the compliant, broken child. Patricia squeezed the fingers sealing the narrative. The groundwork was complete. The whispers would circulate through the country club locker rooms and the charity board meetings. By the time the court date arrived, the entire community would pity Thomas and Patricia Harrell for the heavy burden they were forced to carry. The luncheon transitioned to dessert. The tension at the table softened, replaced by the comfortable hum of shared secrets. Patricia unclasped her purse to retrieve her lipstick, feeling a surge of triumphant relief. The colonial estate was safe. The wind farm collateral was practically secured. Then the heavy oak doors of the dining room swung open. A man walked into the sunlit space, moving with the relaxed entitlement of a legacy member. Douglas Mitchell wore a tailored navy blazer over a crisp golf shirt. He was a prominent local attorney and a frequent fixture in Thomas Harrell's weekend foursome. More importantly, Douglas Mitchell operated as a specialized guardian ad litem for the Sedgwick County probate courts. When a judge required an independent legal proxy to evaluate the competency of a proposed conservatee, they appointed Douglas. He was the institutional mechanism required to legitimize the theft. Douglas navigated the room, stopping to shake hands with a local developer before charting a direct course toward Patricia's table. He carried a leather folio tucked under his arm. The air around him smelled of expensive cigars and moral flexibility. Patricia straightened her posture, offering a bright, welcoming smile. Douglas arrived at the table, greeting Barbara and Diane with practiced Midwestern charm. He placed his hand on the back of the empty chair next to Dulcie. "I do not mean to interrupt your afternoon, ladies," Douglas said, his voice a smooth, resonant baritone designed to project unyielding authority. "I just needed to pass along a brief message to Patricia." He shifted his gaze downward, focusing on the young woman sitting in the charcoal suit. The interaction lasted only a few seconds, but it contained volumes of unspoken transactional data. Douglas looked at Dulcie. He did not offer a standard greeting. His eyes swept over her rigid posture and her blank expression. His face arranged itself into a mask of deep professional pity. It was a performance. It was the look of a burdened legal professional observing a tragic medical case. But beneath the manufactured sympathy, Patricia recognized the cold glimmer of complicity. Douglas turned his attention back to Patricia. He gave a single, subtle nod. The gesture was virtually imperceptible to the other women at the table, but its meaning struck Patricia with the force of a ringing bell. "Thomas dropped off the requisite medical evaluations at my office this morning," Douglas stated, his tone shifting into a confidential register. "The paperwork is moving through the proper channels, Patricia. I have reviewed the psychiatric assessments. We are fully aligned on the necessary course of action. I will file my official recommendation with the judge before the close of business tomorrow." The trap had advanced from a theoretical plan to a physical, documented reality. Thomas had acquired the forged psychological profile. He had delivered it to the corrupt guardian ad litem. Douglas had just confirmed his willingness to co-sign the fraudulent diagnosis. The institutional gatekeeper had accepted the bribe and unlocked the door. Patricia felt a dizzying rush of adrenaline. The wind farm was within their grasp. She looked at her daughter, anticipating a spark of fear, The legal architect of her impending doom was standing inches away, confirming the execution date. Dulcie raised her water goblet, taking a slow, measured sip. She set the crystal glass down, ensuring the base aligned perfectly with the woven pattern of the placemat. She looked up at the sleazy attorney and offered a faint, chilling smile. It was not the smile of a defeated victim. It was the expression of a predator watching a rival step blindly onto a hidden landmine. Patricia felt the icy dread return sharper this time. The illusion of her victory wavered, cracking under the weight of her daughter's unnatural calm. Douglas excused himself, walking toward the men's grill to join his waiting colleagues. Patricia watched him leave the legal machinery of the conservatorship marching forward. The trap was set. But as she looked back at her silent, observing daughter, Patricia could not shake the terrifying suspicion that they were the ones standing inside the cage. The Kansas sky bruised into shades of deep violet and charcoal as night settled over downtown Wichita. Inside my apartment, the ambient temperature felt 10 degrees colder than usual. Thomas, freezing my shared checking account, had cascading effects on my daily operations. I kept the digital thermostat dialed down to 55 degrees to conserve the limited cash I possessed, holding every remaining dollar in strict reserve for basic survival utilities. The financial strangulation was a calculated maneuver designed to manufacture panic. He expected me to call him weeping, begging for a temporary release of funds. Instead, the isolation refined my focus. I sat at my glass desk, wrapped in a thick wool sweater, monitoring the encrypted server logs. The diversionary tactic functioned flawlessly. My father remained tethered to the fake cryptocurrency vault. The digital footprint showed his brute force software hammering uselessly against the decoy partition, burning valuable hours chasing a phantom fortune. The encryption algorithm I utilized would take a supercomputer a decade to crack. Thomas was using a commercial processor. The deception bought me time, shielding the federal conservation transfer happening in Missouri. It also bought Maya the operational window she needed to strike back against her husband. At 10 o'clock, a sharp, rhythmic knock broke the silence of the empty hallway outside my door. I did not expect visitors. The intercom buzzed a moment later, identifying the caller. I unlatched the heavy brass deadbolt and pulled the door open. Maya stood in the dimly lit corridor. The polished African-American corporate strategist who commanded logistics boardrooms had vanished. She wore an oversized dark trench coat, her collar turned up against the biting autumn chill. Her face looked hollowed out, stripped of its usual pristine makeup, exposing the dark, exhaustive circles beneath her eyes. The cubic zirconia ring was gone from her left hand, leaving a pale indentation on her finger. A woman who removes her wedding ring before a late-night meeting is a woman who has already filed the divorce papers in her mind. Her posture lacked the rigid corporate discipline I usually admired. She looked like a survivor, walking away from a catastrophic train wreck. I stepped aside, allowing her to enter the apartment. She walked straight to the kitchen island, bypassing the living room furniture entirely. She did not take off her coat. She reached into her deep pocket and extracted a small, sleek, solid-state hard drive, placing it gently on the granite counter. The metal casing clicked against the stone, a stark, definitive sound. "That is the shadow ledger," Maya stated, her voice a raspy whisper, stripped of all corporate diplomacy. Preston thought changing the administrative passwords on our joint accounts would blind me to the hemorrhage. He underestimated the woman he married. I spent the last 48 hours auditing the raw data dumps from his primary servers, while your father was distracted trying to hack your network. I picked up the drive. The weight of the metal felt significant, heavy with the sins of the Harrell lineage. "What did you find?" I asked, matching her hushed volume. Maya closed her eyes. A tremor ran through her jaw, vibrating under her skin. "He did not lose the venture capital due to supply chain disruptions, Dulcie. The drone manufacturing startup is a hollow shell. He leased empty warehouse space in the industrial district and paid contractors to build empty plastic prototypes to show the angel investors. The entire operation is a front designed to launder his actual activities." She opened her eyes, fixing a hollow, devastated stare on me. He possesses a crippling offshore sports betting addiction. He funneled the seed capital through decentralized exchanges to mask the staggering gambling losses. When the investors demanded a quarterly audit, he panicked. He needed immediate liquidity to cover the deficit before the Securities and Exchange Commission formally indicted him for defrauding the shareholders. She gripped the edge of the granite counter, her knuckles straining against her dark skin. The anger in her eyes shifted into profound, unadulterated grief. He drained the 529 accounts. She whispered, the heartbreak fracturing her stoic facade. He liquidated the college funds we set up for our twin daughters. Every single dollar we saved for their education is gone. He fed our children's future into a digital slot machine. I absorbed the intelligence analyzing the sheer scope of the depravity. Preston, destroying his own startup, aligned with his historical incompetence. Preston, robbing his infant daughters, crossed a boundary that severed the final tether of Maya's loyalty. He had destroyed the fundamental unit of his own family. The SEC is preparing to freeze his remaining domestic assets by the end of the week. Maya continued recovering her breath and smoothing the front of her coat. I took the girls and moved into a secure hotel out of state under my maiden name. I am delivering this drive to the federal investigators tomorrow morning. I am seeking total immunity in exchange for the unredacted ledgers. But I wanted you to have the raw data first. You need to understand exactly what your father is trying to protect. She turned and walked back toward the front door, her posture straightening with every step. The burden of the Harrell family secrets no longer rested on her shoulders. She stepped into the hallway without looking back, leaving me alone with the digital key to their destruction. I carried the drive into my office and connected it to my secure terminal. The hardware initialized, displaying a labyrinth of nested folders on the center monitor. Maya was a master of corporate acquisitions, and her organizational structure was flawless. She had categorized the financial records, the wire transfers, the offshore receipts, and the internal email correspondence into a highly readable chronological index. I spent the next 6 hours dissecting the corpse of my brother's fake empire. The apartment remained silent, save for the rapid clicking of my mechanical keyboard. I cross-referenced the Securities and Exchange Commission docket number Maya had left at the cafe against the internal ledgers. The money trail painted a stark, horrifying portrait of unchecked hubris. Preston had defrauded his investors out of millions, routing the stolen funds through dummy corporations registered in the Caribbean. But the most crucial intelligence did not involve my brother. The vital data centered entirely on my father. Thomas knew everything. I opened a folder labeled Legal Retainers. The documents inside detailed exorbitant wire transfers to high-powered criminal defense attorneys in Chicago and New York. Preston did not possess the liquid capital to hire federal defense counsel of that caliber. The origin routing numbers for those specific wires belonged to Thomas Harrell. My father was funding the legal barricade. But Thomas was inherently asset-rich and cash-poor. He did not keep millions in liquid reserves. He kept his wealth tied up in country club memberships, luxury vehicles, and the sprawling suburban estate. To cover Preston's staggering legal fees and satisfy the initial margin calls from the offshore bookmakers, Thomas had to generate rapid liquid capital. I dug deeper into the metadata, tracking the source of my father's sudden cash injections. I accessed the Sedgwick County Property Registry, utilizing a backdoor portal to bypass the public-facing filters. I pulled the deed history for the Harrell family estate. The colonial mansion, the manicured lawns, the pristine facade of Midwestern royalty. The ledger revealed the fatal error. Thomas had secretly leveraged the estate. He had taken out a predatory secondary commercial mortgage against the property, using the family home as collateral to float Preston's criminal defense. The interest rates attached to the loan were astronomical, designed by shadow lenders targeting desperate borrowers facing imminent ruin. The principal balance was staggering. He had bet the roof over their heads on his ability to find a secondary asset to pay off the debt before the note matured. I leaned back in my chair, the pale blue light of the monitors illuminating the dark office. My eyes burned from screen fatigue, but my mind operated with crystalline clarity. I pulled up a blank spreadsheet and began plugging the raw numbers into a predictive algorithm. I factored the principal of the secret mortgage, the compounding interest, the impending legal fees, and the cost of bribing the sleazy guardian ad litem for the forged psychiatric evaluation. The total deficit matched the commercial valuation of my wind farm down to the final decimal point. I checked the maturity date on the predatory commercial mortgage my father had signed. The shadow lender required a massive balloon payment to satisfy the terms and prevent immediate default. The date glowed on the screen, stark and undeniable. The payment was due this upcoming Friday. The pieces locked into place, forming a perfect, inescapable trap. The emergency conservatorship hearing, the forged medical proxy, the whisper campaign at the country club luncheon. They were not just acts of greed. They were acts of sheer, unadulterated terror. I mapped the exact dollar amount Thomas owed and realized a terrifying truth. If they did not steal my wind farm by Friday morning, Thomas and Patricia would lose their mansion to foreclosure by Friday afternoon. The corporate auditing suite on the 14th floor of the downtown Wichita Financial Center operated on a frequency of absolute controlled silence. My designated workspace featured a broad mahogany desk and floor-to-ceiling glass walls overlooking the busy intersection below. The environment was meticulously sterile, designed to foster deep analytical focus. I sat monitoring a complex supply chain matrix for a regional agricultural client, tracing grain shipments across 3 Midwestern states. The rhythm of my keystrokes provided the only acoustic footprint in the room. That pristine tranquility fractured at exactly 2 in the afternoon. The heavy glass door to my office swung open, striking the rubber doorstop with a harsh, jarring thud. Preston stumbled over the threshold. The pristine golden child the visionary tech founder featured in local business magazines was entirely gone. In his place stood a man actively disintegrating under the crushing weight of federal scrutiny. His custom-tailored suit jacket was severely wrinkled, bearing dark sweat stains beneath the arms. His tie hung loose around his unbuttoned collar. His face, usually flushed with unearned confidence, appeared sallow and hollowed out. Dark purple bags sagged beneath his bloodshot eyes, indicating days of profound sleep deprivation. He moved with a frantic, erratic energy, resembling a trapped animal, realizing the cage door has permanently locked. He bypassed the visitor chairs and marched directly to the edge of my desk, planting his trembling hands flat against the polished wood. He gasped for air, pulling oxygen into his lungs as if he had just sprinted up 14 flights of stairs. "I need the deed, Dulcie," he rasped, his voice cracking on the first syllable. I did not flinch. I did not close the spreadsheet on my monitor. I slowly removed my reading glasses, folding the frames and placing them precisely next to my keyboard. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, maintaining a posture of relaxed, clinical detachment. "You are violating firm security protocols by bypassing the reception desk, Preston," I stated, keeping my volume exceptionally low and steady. He shook his head, dismissing the warning with a frantic wave of his hand. "Listen to me," he pleaded, leaning closer across the desk. The odor of stale alcohol and raw fear radiated from his skin. "The venture capital investors are calling in their notes. The local lenders are freezing my operating accounts. I just need a temporary transfer of the wind farm parcel. Just a 6-week collateral pledge. I can leverage the equity to satisfy the margin calls and bridge the gap until the next funding round clears. You will get the title back before Thanksgiving. I promise." It was a pathetic, transparent pitch. The sheer audacity of asking for my primary asset while an SEC investigation loomed over his head demonstrated the depth of his delusion. He genuinely believed he could continue to manipulate the family ecosystem to float his criminal enterprise. He assumed the standard Herald dynamic, where his failures were perpetually subsidized by my sacrifices, would hold steady even as the federal authorities circled his empty warehouses. I sat forward, resting my forearms on the desk. I looked directly into his bloodshot eyes, studying the terrified man who had pawned his wife's wedding ring to feed an offshore gambling addiction. "There is no next funding round," I replied, my voice devoid of any familial warmth. "The angel investors are gone. The domestic accounts are locked. You are bleeding out on the operating table, and you want me to hand over my only performing asset to act as a temporary bandage?" He opened his mouth to argue, to spin another fabricated narrative about market disruptions and supply chain delays. I raised a single finger, silencing him instantly. "Let us conduct a basic comparative audit of our respective business models. Preston," I continued delivering the words with surgical precision. "You built a drone manufacturing company. Your entire enterprise relies on fragile, plastic prototypes that require constant external charging. The moment the battery depletes, the machine falls out of the sky and shatters on the pavement. You require perpetual artificial nourishment to stay airborne. When the money stops flowing, you crash." I gestured toward the window, pointing toward the western horizon where my land sat miles away. "My property operates on a different fundamental law of physics," I stated. "The turbines possess deep concrete roots anchoring them permanently into the Kansas soil. They harness natural momentum. They generate their own power. They are entirely self-sustaining. I do not require external validation or fraudulent seed capital to keep the blades turning. The wind farm produces actual, tangible value, while your drones are nothing but expensive, brittle toys waiting to break." The metaphorical dissection struck him with devastating force. The truth pierced through the final layers of his manufactured ego. For his entire life, Thomas and Patricia had shielded him from the raw mathematics of his own incompetence. They had built a padded room around his vanity, ensuring he never felt the impact of a failed venture. Now he was standing in my office, absorbing the cold, undeniable reality that he was a failure. The humiliation mutated instantly into raw, unrestrained rage. The terrified beggar vanished, replaced by a furious, entitled child throwing a catastrophic tantrum. His face flushed a dark, dangerous crimson. He let out a guttural sound of pure frustration. He reached across the desk and grabbed the heavy crystal water tumbler resting near my keyboard. He hurled the glass downward with all his remaining strength. The tumbler struck the edge of the mahogany desk and shattered into dozens of jagged pieces. The sharp noise echoed like a gunshot in the sterile corporate suite. Crystal shards rained across the carpet, and water pooled over the polished wood, soaking into a stack of printed audit reports. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I remained perfectly still, observing his meltdown with the detached fascination of a scientist recording a volatile chemical reaction. His inability to control his impulses only verified the necessity of my defensive strategy. "You think you are untouchable?" Preston screamed, his voice echoing off the glass walls, drawing the attention of junior analysts in the outer corridor. "You think sitting in this sterile office makes you superior to us? You do not own anything. Dad is already pulling the strings. He initiated the legal mechanism yesterday. You are going to lose the land anyway, Dulcie. The court is going to strip your rights and hand the deed to him. You could have done this the easy way, but now they are going to take everything you have." He backed away from the desk, his chest heaving, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He pointed a trembling finger at my face, delivering one final, desperate threat. "You are finished," he spat, turning on his heel. He stormed toward the door, moving with the blind, chaotic momentum of a man fleeing a burning building. As he yanked the heavy glass door open, his hand brushed against the side of his leather briefcase. The brass clasp unfastened. A single, thick manila folder slipped from the interior compartment, tumbling toward the floor. The folder struck the carpet, sliding a few inches back into my office, before coming to a rest near the scattered shards of crystal. Preston did not notice the dropped item. He was too consumed by his own fury and terror to check his inventory. He marched down the hallway, leaving a trail of startled coworkers in his wake. I waited until the sound of his heavy footsteps faded into the ambient noise of the financial center. I stood up, ignoring the spilled water on my desk. I walked around the mahogany furniture, carefully avoiding the broken glass. I crouched down and retrieved the manila folder. The paper felt heavy, substantial. It carried the distinct texture of official court documentation. I carried the folder back to my chair and opened the cover. The document inside bore the official seal of the Sedgwick County Probate Court. The header listed an upcoming emergency asset management hearing. I scanned the dense legal boilerplate, scrolling down to the primary exhibit attached to the summons. It was a comprehensive psychological evaluation. The name printed at the top of the medical assessment was Dulcie Harrell. The text detailed a horrifying fabricated narrative outlining severe paranoid delusions, erratic behavior, and a total inability to manage independent financial affairs. It painted a portrait of a young woman suffering from a rapid, catastrophic mental decline, requiring immediate custodial intervention. It was the exact diagnostic criteria necessary to justify a hostile conservatorship under Kansas law. I turned to the final page, observing the signature lines at the bottom of the evaluation. The ink was fresh. 2 distinct signatures finalized the fraudulent diagnosis. The first signature belonged to a private suburban psychiatrist known for catering to the discreet demands of the local country club elite. The second signature, the endorsement that provided the document with its lethal judicial authority, belonged to Douglas Mitchell. The sleazy court-appointed guardian ad litem had fulfilled his promise. He had officially co-signed the lie, validating the theft on behalf of the county courts. The trap was fully constructed, signed, and sealed. Preston was right. The legal mechanism was already moving, bearing down on me with the crushing weight of the Kansas judicial system. I closed the folder, sliding it into my desk drawer. The timeline was shrinking, and the battlefield was shifting to the courtroom. I needed to deploy the Trojan horse. The reality of a frozen bank ledger manifests in subtle physiological shifts before it registers as a true crisis. It begins with the ambient temperature. Autumn in Kansas carries a sharp, biting wind that strips the warmth from uninsulated brick buildings. My apartment thermostat remained locked at 50 degrees. I wore layers of thick wool indoors, relying on body heat rather than the central furnace. Thomas, cutting my access to the shared emergency reserves, was a calculated siege tactic designed to break my endurance. He expected the sudden deprivation to force a tearful surrender. Instead of dialing his number to beg for a temporary reprieve, I treated the financial drought as an operational constraint. I audited my pantry. My diet consisted of generic rice lentils and black coffee brewed from tap water. The daily commute provided another arena for endurance testing. The luxury of an idle sedan burning unleaded fuel was no longer a viable expense. I walked the 3 miles from my downtown loft to the financial center. The pavement radiated a dull, persistent ache through the soles of my professional heels. Every morning I navigated the busy crosswalks, surrounded by idling vehicles and hurried executives. My legs burned and my fingers grew stiff from the frost, but my mind remained remarkably clear. Enduring physical discomfort is a simple transaction when the reward is permanent independence. My father assumed a young woman accustomed to suburban comfort would shatter under the weight of sudden poverty. He miscalculated. I was not enduring a punishment. I was executing a tactical retreat. Returning to my quiet, freezing apartment after a 10-hour auditing shift, I devoted my evenings to maintaining the digital illusion. The conservation easement Valerie filed in Missouri was actively moving through the federal holding queue. The 48-hour window was closing, bridging the gap between vulnerability and total immunity. But until that federal seal finalized, my defense relied entirely on camouflage. I sat at my glass desk wrapped in a heavy blanket, monitoring the Sedgwick County Public Property Registry. This was the exact portal my father and his corrupt legal fixers utilized to track their impending prize. The local database operated on a legacy server, updating its public-facing records at midnight. I needed the system to reflect a ghost town, an environment that looked identical to the thriving asset they intended to hijack, but was actually hollowed out from the inside. I keyed my search parameters into the county website. The screen loaded, pulling the latest property tax manifest for the wind farm. My breathing slowed as the page rendered the text. There it sat, undisturbed and pristine. The ownership line proudly displayed my full legal name. The asset appeared highly liquid, unencumbered, and ready for hostile seizure. The public records formed a flawless mirror reflecting the exact reality Thomas wanted to see. He believed he was hunting a secured target. He did not possess the forensic foresight to cross-reference the local deeds against the restricted federal environmental dockets. By keeping the local ledger visually intact, I ensured his confidence remained high. Confidence breeds arrogance, and arrogance creates fatal blind spots. The pinnacle of that arrogance arrived on a Thursday evening via a forwarded electronic message. I was reviewing a client supply chain matrix when a notification chimed on my personal device. The sender was an older woman named Helen, a longtime fixture at the Oakmont Country Club and a peripheral friend of my mother. Helen possessed a notorious habit of broadcasting local gossip through unprompted photo messages sent to her extensive contact list. She assumed I would appreciate seeing my father enjoying a successful night out. I opened the email attachment. The image loaded on my screen capturing a vibrant scene at an exclusive local steakhouse known for catering to the Wichita corporate elite. Thomas occupied the center of the frame. He wore a tailored velvet dinner jacket, his face flushed with triumphant joy. He was standing beside a linen-draped table, surrounded by 3 grinning men wearing expensive suits. I recognized 2 of them as senior underwriting executives from a prominent regional commercial bank. In my father's hand rested a heavy, dark green bottle of vintage champagne. The distinct gold foil label identified it as a rare cuvée, a vintage that retailed for a staggering sum. The cork was mid-flight, captured perfectly by the camera flash. A spray of carbonated wine caught the ambient light, resembling liquid diamonds. Below the photograph, Helen had typed a brief congratulatory caption, celebrating Thomas securing a lucrative new venture. I stared at the image, the glowing pixels illuminating the dark office. The dramatic irony was so profound it bordered on cinematic. Thomas was not celebrating a successful real estate acquisition or a legitimate corporate merger. He was celebrating the preliminary approval of his desperate commercial bridge loan. He had successfully convinced the underwriting executives to extend him millions of dollars in rapid liquid capital to save his suburban mansion and fund Preston's criminal defense. To secure that capital, Thomas required a collateral pledge. He had submitted the forged commercial appraisal of the wind farm, claiming the renewable energy asset as his own impending property. He guaranteed the loan against land he intended to steal through a corrupt conservatorship. He was drinking premium champagne, smiling for the camera, blissfully unaware of the catastrophic trap he had just stepped into. By submitting those loan documents to a federally insured financial institution using an asset that was currently transitioning into an untouchable federal conservation trust, Thomas had crossed a lethal threshold. He had not merely lied to a bank manager. He had committed federal wire fraud. The moment my federal shield finalized his loan application would transform from a shady hometown handshake into a documented federal crime. He was collateralizing a ghost. I traced the edge of my phone, observing his arrogant smile. He believed he had outsmarted his own daughter. He was currently toasting his own impending indictment. I closed the image, minimizing the application. The digital victory provided a cold, sterile satisfaction, but the physical timeline still required careful navigation. My father had secured the preliminary loan approval, but the bank would require the finalized conservatorship decree to formally close the deal and disperse the funds. He needed a judge to declare me incompetent and hand him the deed. The silence of my apartment broke early the next morning. It was Friday. I was standing by the kitchen counter brewing a cup of bitter instant coffee when a sharp, authoritative knock rattled my front door. It was not the hesitant tap of a neighbor or the rhythmic rap of a delivery driver. It was a knock designed to command immediate compliance. I set the ceramic mug down. The dark liquid rippled from the vibration. I walked down the short hallway and peered through the brass peephole. A man stood in the corridor wearing a drab gray suit, holding a thick manila envelope. He held a clipboard tucked under his left arm. His posture signaled routine, bureaucratic boredom. He was a professional process server. I unlatched the deadbolt and pulled the door open. The corridor air flowed into the room, bringing the scent of floor wax and stale tobacco. "Dulcie Harrell?" the man asked, his voice flat and uninvested. "Yes," I replied, keeping my tone equally neutral. He held out the thick envelope. "You have been served." He turned and walked away down the hall before my fingers even closed around the coarse paper. He did not care about the contents of the delivery. He was simply a cog in the judicial machinery, carrying out his designated function. I closed the door, locking the deadbolt with a firm click. I carried the envelope back to the kitchen island, resting it on the granite surface next to my coffee. I reached into a drawer, retrieved a steel letter opener, and sliced through the adhesive seal. I slid the documents out, unfolding the heavy stock paper. The official seal of the Sedgwick County Probate Court sat stamped at the top of the primary page. Below the crest, bold black lettering spelled out the nature of the filing. It was a formal, court-mandated summons for an emergency family asset management hearing. My eyes scanned the subsequent paragraphs, absorbing the logistical details of the ambush. Thomas and his legal architect, Douglas Mitchell, had fast-tracked the forged psychiatric evaluation through the compliant local registry. They had successfully petitioned a sympathetic judge to bypass the standard waiting periods, citing my fabricated, rapid mental decline as a justification for immediate intervention. The scheduling block highlighted the final, unalterable deadline. The hearing was docketed for the upcoming Friday morning, exactly 7 days away. The location was assigned to a private, closed-door chamber in the downtown courthouse, ensuring the theft would occur far from public scrutiny. The trap was officially set. The legal jaws were open, waiting for me to step inside. I folded the summons, slipping it back into the torn envelope. My father had dictated the time and the place for his final victory. He expected a broken, starved, confused victim to walk into that chamber and surrender her life. He was about to receive an education in forensic accounting. The thick manila envelope resting on my kitchen island contained the institutional blueprint for my destruction. I smoothed the creased pages of the court summons, tracing the embossed seal of the Sedgwick County Probate Court. The document mandated my appearance at the emergency asset management hearing on Friday morning. It was a formal invitation to my own legal execution. The standard reactionary protocol for any professional facing a fraudulent legal ambush is to immediately retain aggressive defense counsel. A normal citizen would hire a litigator to file an injunction, block the hearing, and drag the corrupt psychiatric evaluation into a lengthy discovery process. I discarded that conventional strategy within 30 seconds of reading the summons. Retaining a lawyer meant filing formal motions in the county court. Formal motions required time. The moment a defense attorney submitted a contestation, the judge would initiate a standard discovery phase, granting my father's legal team the authority to subpoena my recent communications, travel logs, and financial movements. The ensuing investigation would inevitably unearth my clandestine trip to Missouri. They would discover the pending conservation easement before the mandatory 48-hour federal holding period expired. Thomas would instantly recognize the danger and pivot his strategy, filing a temporary restraining order to freeze the wind farm deed in its current vulnerable state. Fighting the battle on his chosen terrain, utilizing the slow, grinding machinery of the local courts, would expose my shadow exfiltration. I needed the federal shield to finalize in total, suffocating silence. To ensure that silence, I had to convince my father that he had already won. I had to terminate his surveillance and lull him into a state of supreme, unshakable arrogance. I left the kitchen, leaving the cold coffee and the summons on the granite counter. I walked into my home office and sat at the glass desk. The ambient temperature in the apartment hovered at a biting 50 degrees, a direct result of Thomas freezing my emergency checking account. The physical discomfort served as a sharp reminder of his ultimate goal. He wanted me desperate. He wanted me terrified. He wanted the resilient, independent auditor to shatter under the weight of forced poverty and social isolation. I decided to give him exactly what he wanted. I woke my primary terminal and opened a blank, encrypted email draft addressing the recipient line to my father, with my mother copied on the delivery. In the corporate sector, a Trojan horse is a piece of malicious code disguised as a benign or desirable software update. The target willingly downloads the file, believing it will enhance their system, unaware that the payload will dismantle their defenses from the inside. I was about to deploy a psychological Trojan horse. I rested my fingers on the mechanical keyboard, staring at the blinking cursor. Writing this message required a complete suspension of my natural vocabulary. I had to purge the clinical, precise language of a supply chain auditor. I had to channel the fabricated persona my mother had so meticulously constructed during her country club luncheons. I needed to sound erratic, overwhelmed, and deeply fatigued. I began typing, selecting each word with forensic precision. Dad, the email began, deliberately avoiding the formal Thomas I usually employed during conflicts. I received the court summons this morning. I do not have the energy to fight this anymore. You were right. I paused, observing the sentences on the screen. The admission of defeat would act as digital adrenaline for his ego. Thomas possessed a pathological need to be validated as the supreme patriarchal authority. I continued drafting, weaving his cruel financial strangulation into the narrative as the catalyst for my breaking point. The cold in this apartment is unbearable, I typed, feeding his belief that his siege tactics had successfully crushed my endurance. I cannot access my funds to pay the heating bill, and the isolation is making it hard to think clearly. My mind feels fractured lately. I am so tired of analyzing everything. The pressure is too heavy, and I realize I am no longer capable of managing these responsibilities on my own. I read the paragraph back. The tone mirrored the exact description Patricia had delivered to her society friends. It was a masterpiece of manufactured vulnerability. It validated their fraudulent psychiatric evaluation, proving their lies correct. To seal the trap, however, I had to offer him the ultimate prize. I had to guarantee his attendance at the Friday hearing with his guard entirely lowered. I will attend the hearing on Friday morning, I concluded, my fingers moving steadily across the keys. I will not bring legal counsel. I will sign the property management proxy in front of the judge. I just want this nightmare to end. Please let us resolve this quietly so I can rest. I added a simple, exhausted sign-off. I did not review the text a third time. Overthinking the phrasing might lead to unnecessary revisions that could strip the raw, desperate frequency from the prose. I moved the cursor over the send icon. The psychological dynamic of the Harrell household always rewarded total submission. During my adolescence, whenever Preston broke a valuable heirloom or failed a preparatory school exam, the ensuing chaotic rage from my father only subsided when someone absorbed the blame and bowed to his authority. Defiance prolonged the agony. Surrender purchased immediate peace. I was leveraging that deeply ingrained behavioral conditioning. I clicked send. The digital pigeon flew, carrying the toxic payload toward the suburban colonial estate. I leaned back in the ergonomic chair, crossing my arms over my heavy wool sweater. The waiting commenced. I anticipated a delay. I assumed Thomas would consult with his sleazy attorney Douglas Mitchell before responding. I assumed he would dissect the email, searching for hidden sarcasm or legal traps. I underestimated the blinding power of a narcissist's greed. 3 minutes later, a sharp chime echoed through the freezing office. The incoming notification flashed across the center monitor. The sender was Thomas Harrell. He had replied with staggering speed, indicating he was likely sitting beside his smartphone, waiting anxiously for the financial starvation to yield results. He needed the wind farm collateral to secure his commercial bridge loan and save his mansion. My email represented his salvation. I opened his response. The text dripped with a sickly, manufactured paternal affection that made my stomach tighten. "Dulcie, sweetheart," his message read, the artificial warmth practically radiating from the pixels. "Your mother and I are so incredibly relieved. We have been sick with worry over your recent decline. It takes immense bravery to admit when you need help. You are making the right choice for your health and for the legacy of this family." He did not acknowledge the frozen bank accounts or the cruel isolation. He seamlessly adopted the role of the benevolent savior, stepping in to rescue his damaged child. "We will see you Friday morning," he concluded. "Do not worry about a thing. Let Dad handle the heavy lifting from here on out. We love you." I stared at the glowing words. "Let Dad handle the heavy lifting." It was the exact phrase he used when he took over a vulnerable client portfolio right before liquidating their assets to pad his own commission. The predatory intent was thinly veiled behind the saccharine vocabulary. He believed the prey had willingly walked into the snare and locked the cage door from the inside. He was experiencing the euphoric high of a bloodless victory. The immediate consequence of his triumph materialized on my secondary monitor. While reading his email, I kept the secure server logs open on the adjacent screen. For the past 2 weeks, the red warning banners had flashed continuously, recording the relentless, automated brute force attack my father was executing against the fake cryptocurrency decoy I had planted on the outer firewall. As I watched the scrolling data, the cascading streams of authorized login attempts slowed. The rapid-fire pinging against the encrypted partition faltered. A moment later, the external connection severed entirely. The server logs ran blank. The digital siege ceased. Thomas had manually deactivated his hacking software. Believing I had surrendered the actual physical deed to the wind farm, he no longer required the phantom digital wealth he thought was hidden in my servers. The Trojan horse had executed flawlessly. By feeding his ego and offering him the ultimate prize on a silver platter, I had convinced him to call off his digital hounds. He was terminating his surveillance operations, ceasing his hostile probes, and turning his attention entirely toward Friday morning. He would spend the next few days finalizing his commercial bridge loan and preparing his triumphant courtroom performance. He was looking the wrong way. The silence in my apartment deepened, no longer vibrating with the threat of an active cyber intrusion. The final obstacle to the federal transfer had just voluntarily blinded itself. The 48-hour clearance window was now safe, shielded by my father's own staggering arrogance. I sat in the freezing room wrapped in wool and watched the empty server logs, feeling a profound cold satisfaction. The trap was indeed set. But the architects of my misery had no idea they were the ones standing on the trigger. The cardboard boxes stacked against the exposed brick wall absorbed the ambient light of the freezing apartment. I dragged a strip of heavy packing tape across the final carton, sealing away the last remnants of my daily life. The sharp tearing sound echoed through the hollow rooms. Relocating your existence requires a specific type of unsentimental arithmetic. You evaluate every physical object, assessing its utility against its potential to be used as leverage. My parents possessed a predatory instinct for exploiting sentiment. If I left a meaningful photograph or a cherished heirloom behind, they would claim it hostage. I neutralized that vulnerability by stripping my environment down to the studs. My living space now mirrored my internal architecture, bare functional and prepared for immediate extraction. The rented furniture was scheduled for pickup on Monday. The utilities were slated for termination. I had erased my physical footprint from the city of Wichita, leaving my father nothing to grasp when his financial freefall began. I walked into the home office, rubbing my bare hands together to generate friction against the 50-degree chill. The custom server rack hummed a low, steady vibration. I woke the primary terminal, routing a series of encrypted files to the laser printer resting on the edge of the glass desk. The machine whirred to life, inhaling blank paper and exhaling the documented ruin of the Harrell family. The scent of warm toner filled the cold air. I stood by the output tray, collecting the pages as they slid from the rollers. This was not a random assortment of grievances. It was a highly structured forensic arsenal designed to dismantle a corrupt legal ambush. The first stack contained the raw data from Maya. I reviewed the printed spreadsheets detailing Preston's shadow ledger. The rows and columns formed a roadmap of unmitigated greed. The offshore wire transfers, the falsified drone manufacturing invoices, the drained college funds meant for his twin daughters. The numbers told a story of a terrified man burning his own household to the ground to keep his vanity intact. The second stack consisted of the Securities and Exchange Commission docket. The federal seal printed sharply in black ink, authenticating the impending criminal investigation. It proved Preston was not a struggling entrepreneur seeking a temporary bridge loan. He was a target of federal law enforcement. The final stack held my personal contribution to the trap. I gathered the time-stamped intrusion logs captured by my digital tripwire. The pages displayed the exact IP addresses tracing my father's late-night cyber assault on my servers. It documented his unauthorized download of the blank transfer on death deed and the emergency medical proxy. It was the irrefutable digital fingerprint of his conspiracy. I aligned the edges of the thick paper stack, tapping them against the glass desk, until they formed a perfect uniform block. I retrieved a slim, charcoal leather briefcase from the closet. The metal clasps snapped open with a crisp, definitive click. I placed the forensic arsenal inside, securing the documents under the interior strap. I closed the lid, locking the brass latches. The briefcase felt heavy, substantial. It contained enough verifiable data to shatter my parents' suburban facade and send my brother to a federal penitentiary. I carried the briefcase to the front door, resting it beside my overnight bag. The physical preparations were complete. The trap was armed. The only remaining task was to survive the psychological weight of the impending dawn. I walked back into the main living area and stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the dark expanse of the city. Beyond the grid of illuminated streetlights and the scattered headlights of late-night commuters, the vast Kansas plains stretched into the invisible horizon. The wind battered against the thick glass, a silent, relentless force sweeping across the flat earth. The darkness offered a canvas for reflection. I placed my palms against the cold window pane, staring into the void. My grandmother used to stand by a similar window in her own home, watching the same wind tear across the fields. She built the agricultural portfolio that funded this family, relying on a mind sharper than a steel trap. Yet society dictated she stand in the background while her husband took the credit. When my grandfather made catastrophic bets on failing livestock futures, my grandmother quietly balanced the ledgers, absorbing the deficit to protect his fragile pride. She was the first in a long lineage of capable women forced to act as shock absorbers for the failures of arrogant men. My mother Patricia continued the tradition in her own twisted manner. She watched Thomas leverage their suburban mansion into a precarious mountain of commercial debt. Instead of holding him accountable, she demanded I sacrifice my sanity and my assets to maintain his illusion of wealth. She weaponized her own daughter to subsidize her husband's incompetence. Maya had fallen into the exact same generational snare. She poured her brilliant corporate strategy skills into Preston's hollow startup, trying to prop up a man who repaid her loyalty by pawning her wedding ring and stealing from their children. The pattern was a systemic infection passed down through the Harrell bloodline. The men created chaos, and the women were expected to liquidate their own futures to purchase the cleanup. I traced the condensation forming on the glass. The cycle required a willing participant to endure. It required a daughter who valued familial approval more than her own survival. It required a woman willing to sign her name on a fraudulent proxy document just to keep the peace at the Sunday dinner table. My parents believed I was that woman. They looked at my quiet demeanor and my analytical profession and assumed I was merely a sophisticated calculator they could reprogram to balance their toxic checkbook. They mistook my silence for compliance. They failed to recognize that silence is also the primary operating condition of a predator waiting in the brush. I was not going to balance their ledger. I was going to close the account. Tomorrow morning, I would walk into that private courthouse chamber. I would look at the corrupt guardian ad litem and the forged psychiatric evaluation. I would listen to my father spin his tragic narrative of my mental decline. And then I would drop the heavy leather briefcase onto the mahogany table and terminate the toxic lineage permanently. I would be the final woman in this family asked to pay for a man's unearned ego. The ambient tension in the apartment shifted, wrapping around my shoulders like a physical weight. The agonizing psychological stretch before a definitive battle often breaks a target's resolve. The silence tricks the mind into second-guessing the strategy. I regulated my breathing, inhaling the freezing air, counting the seconds to maintain my optimal heart rate. I did not need comfort, I needed clearance. The profound quiet of the midnight hour shattered. A sharp, rhythmic vibration emanated from the kitchen island. My encrypted smartphone danced across the granite surface, buzzing with the urgency of a high-priority incoming transmission. I stepped away from the window, the cold glass leaving a faint imprint against my palms. I crossed the empty living room, my boots striking the bare hardwood floor. I picked up the device, authenticating my access with a secure biometric scan. The screen illuminated, displaying a text message routed through a highly encrypted, decentralized messaging application. The sender designation was shielded, displaying only a randomized alphanumeric string. I recognized the cryptographic signature immediately. It was Aunt Valerie, operating from her quiet fiduciary office in Kansas City, Missouri. I tapped the notification expanding the message. The text was brief, stripped of any celebratory punctuation or emotional phrasing. Valerie adhered to the strict clinical communication protocols we established during our initial meeting. The message contained 2 sentences. The conservation easement has cleared the mandatory holding period and is fully recorded in the Federal Registry. The domestic vault is officially at 0. I stared at the glowing pixels. The knot of localized tension in my chest unraveled, replaced by a surging tide of cold, unadulterated relief. The 48-hour window had successfully closed. The agonizing wait was over. My father had spent the last 2 days celebrating his preliminary commercial bridge loan, drinking vintage champagne, and polishing his courtroom performance. He had remained entirely blind to the invisible maneuver executing in the background. The deed to the wind farm was no longer hovering in a vulnerable transitional state. The federal government had stamped the final seal, locking the land behind a wall of impenetrable environmental statutes. The asset had officially vanished from the Kansas jurisdiction, crossing a legal border my father could never breach. He intended to walk into the Sedgwick County Courthouse tomorrow to seize my wealth. He was preparing to steal an empty box. The trap was fully armed. The evidence was printed, and the primary target was safely airlifted out of the blast radius. I turned off the phone, slipping it into my pocket. The storm was coming, but I was the one holding the lightning. The morning sky over Wichita fractured into shades of pale gray and winter sunlight. Friday had arrived. I walked up the broad concrete steps of the Sedgwick County Courthouse, holding the charcoal leather briefcase in my right hand. The cold Kansas wind tugged at the hem of my suit jacket, but my core temperature remained regulated. I bypassed the crowded public galleries, navigating the maze of institutional corridors toward the restricted administrative wing. The heels of my boots clicked a steady, rhythmic cadence against the terrazzo floors. Chamber 4B served as the designated arena for private probate matters. These closed-door hearings shielded the local elite from public scrutiny, allowing wealthy families to dismantle their relatives in comfortable secrecy. I pushed the heavy oak door open, stepping over the threshold. The air inside smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. A long, polished wooden table dominated the center of the room, reflecting the harsh fluorescent lighting overhead. The opposing faction had already assembled, arriving early to establish territorial dominance. My father, Thomas, sat near the head of the table, wearing a pristine navy pinstripe suit. He projected the relaxed entitlement of a man who believed the battle was already won. Beside him, Patricia arranged her posture to convey tragic exhaustion, dabbing the corner of her eye with a pristine tissue. Preston occupied the chair next to our mother. He looked worse than he had during his meltdown in my office. The tailored fabric of his jacket hung loosely over his shoulders, and his skin carried a sickly, sallow tint. The looming federal investigation was draining the life from his veins, but today he managed to sit upright, clinging to the delusion that my stolen wind farm would buy his salvation. Flanking my father sat a man I did not recognize personally, but knew intimately by reputation. He was a high-priced litigator imported from a prestigious firm, a specialist in wealth extraction disguised as asset management. He wore rimless glasses and kept his hands resting atop a meticulously organized stack of blue-bound legal folders. Finally seated at the far end of the table was Douglas Mitchell. The corrupt guardian ad litem adjusted his silk tie, offering a solemn nod to my parents. The gatekeeper was in position, ready to validate their fabricated narrative. I walked to the solitary, empty chair positioned across the divide. I did not greet my family. I did not offer a polite smile to the litigator. I set the charcoal leather briefcase flat on the wooden surface, aligning its edges parallel to the table. I took my seat, folding my hands in my lap, assuming the exact clinical posture I utilized during hostile corporate audits. A side door opened, interrupting the thick quiet of the chamber. Judge Lawson entered carrying a stack of dockets. He was a fixture at the Oakmont Country Club, possessing a ruddy complexion and a silver mustache. He did not wear his judicial robes for this private hearing, opting instead for a charcoal blazer. The choice of attire signaled the informal, clubby nature of the impending transaction. Lawson took his seat at the head of the table. He exchanged a brief, familiar glance with my father before clearing his throat and opening the file folder resting before him. "We are here to review an emergency petition for asset management and temporary conservatorship," Lawson began, his voice projecting a practiced, bureaucratic drone. "The petitioners assert that the respondent is currently suffering from a rapid psychological decline, rendering her incapable of managing significant financial holdings or providing for her own basic welfare." The judge turned his gaze toward Patricia. The cue was flawless. My mother leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, and let out a broken, ragged sigh. It was a masterclass in performative grief honed during decades of country club luncheons and charity galas. "Your Honor," Patricia whispered, her voice trembling with manufactured sorrow. "Watching our daughter fade away has been the most agonizing experience of our lives. Dulcie used to be so sharp, so capable, but over the past few months, the light behind her eyes just vanished. She locked herself in a freezing apartment, refusing to turn on the heat. She alienated her friends. We tried to reach out, but she responds with paranoia and delusions." Patricia paused, allowing a single tear to escape and track down her powdered cheek. She reached out, gripping Thomas by the forearm, seeking support from the stoic patriarch. "We are terrified she will cause irreparable harm to herself and the legacy my mother left her," Patricia concluded, her voice breaking on the final syllable. "We just want to keep her safe until she gets the help she needs." Thomas patted her hand, adopting an expression of grim reluctance. "It breaks my heart to sit across from her like this, Your Honor," Thomas added, his tone resonant and heavy. "But the responsibilities attached to the agricultural properties in her portfolio require lucid administration. We are facing severe market fluctuations. Left unattended, those assets will default. We are stepping in to preserve her future so it remains intact when she recovers." The sheer audacity of the lie hung in the sterile air. They were actively leveraging my inheritance to save their own suburban mansion from foreclosure, while Preston stared at a federal prison sentence. Yet they painted themselves as selfless guardians protecting a broken child. I watched their performance without blinking, registering the micro-expressions of deceit playing across their faces. I offered no reactive outburst to validate their narrative of instability. Judge Lawson nodded sympathetically, digesting the theatrical display. He turned his attention toward the far end of the table. "Mr. Mitchell, as the court-appointed evaluator, what are your findings regarding the respondent's competency?" Douglas Mitchell cleared his throat, opening his leather folio. He extracted the multi-page medical proxy I had seen drop from Preston's briefcase days earlier. "I have spent the past 48 hours reviewing the psychiatric evaluations conducted by a licensed specialist," Mitchell stated, projecting the somber authority of a seasoned legal professional. "The diagnostic criteria are clear. The respondent is experiencing a dissociative break characterized by acute paranoia and an inability to process logistical reality." He slid the forged evaluation across the polished wood until it rested near the judge's elbow. "It is my formal recommendation, as the guardian ad litem, that temporary custodial and financial authority be transferred to Thomas Harrell immediately to prevent further systemic decay of her estate. Mitchell concluded, sealing the trap. The medical consensus requires swift intervention. Lawson skimmed the fraudulent document. He did not ask for a secondary opinion. He did not question the expedited timeline or the suspicious convenience of the psychiatric diagnosis. The institutional machinery was heavily greased, functioning exactly as Thomas had paid for it to operate. The high-priced litigator sitting beside my father seamlessly took control of the momentum. He was the designated closer, assigned to secure the final signature before any lingering doubts could surface. He slid a thick stack of printed pages from his blue-bound folder. The document was a comprehensive, irrevocable property transfer, granting Thomas unilateral proxy rights over the wind farm parcel. The lawyer pushed the paper across the wide table, bridging the gap, until the pages sat directly in front of my folded hands. Yellow adhesive flags marked the signature lines, jutting out like bright warning signs. Miss Harrell, the litigator, said, employing a smooth, condescending baritone designed to soothe a panicked animal. I know this feels overwhelming, but your parents are acting out of genuine concern. By authorizing this transfer today, you are relieving yourself of a heavy administrative burden. You can rest. You can focus on your recovery without the stress of managing commercial real estate. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a heavy gold fountain pen. The metal caught the harsh fluorescent light, gleaming like a weapon. He held the pen out, offering it to me across the table. His smile was predatory, masked as professional courtesy. Just place your signature on the flagged lines, the litigator urged, gesturing toward the paperwork. Let your father preserve the family estate while you get well. The quiet in the chamber grew dense. My father leaned forward slightly, his breath catching in his throat. Patricia held her tissue suspended near her chin. Preston stared at the gold pen, his bloodshot eyes wide with desperate anticipation. They believed the agonizing wait was over. They assumed the exhausted, broken version of their daughter they had starved and isolated was about to hand them their financial salvation. I sat perfectly still. The charcoal leather briefcase rested inches from the fraudulent contract. Dulcie does not look at the pen. She looks directly into her father's eyes, refusing to break eye contact, and says, "I will not authorize a blind transfer." The silence in Chamber 4B crystallized, turning brittle and sharp. The high-priced litigator froze, his arm still extended, the gold fountain pen hovering over the fraudulent proxy document. He had spent his entire career bullying compliant victims into submission. Encountering a target who simply refused to participate short-circuited his standard operating procedure. He slowly lowered his hand, placing the expensive writing instrument back into his breast pocket, and retreated into his leather chair. My father could not maintain his polished restraint. The benevolent patriarch persona shattered instantly, exposing the terrified debtor hiding underneath. Thomas slammed his closed fist against the heavy mahogany table. The impact generated a loud, echoing crack that rattled the crystal water pitchers resting nearby. "Sign the paper, Dulcie," he demanded, his voice losing its manufactured sorrow and plunging into a harsh, guttural bark. "You are sick. You do not understand what you are doing. Judge Lawson, you need to compel her signature right now. She is endangering the estate." I did not flinch at the sudden noise. I maintained my direct eye contact with the man who had starved me, isolated me, and attempted to erase my legal existence. I reached out and pulled the charcoal leather briefcase toward the center of my workspace. I placed my thumbs over the twin brass latches and pushed downward. The metal mechanism sprang open with two crisp, definitive clicks. I lifted the lid, exposing the dense stacks of forensic evidence. The time for passive endurance had officially expired. "You are correct about one thing, Dad," I stated, keeping my vocal tone flat and sterile, mirroring the exact cadence I utilized to terminate corrupt corporate accounts. "The estate is endangered, but the threat did not originate from my apartment. The threat is sitting right next to you." I retrieved the first stack of printed documents and slid them across the polished wood. The pages glided over the table, coming to a halt directly in front of Judge Lawson. "That is a formal docket from the Securities and Exchange Commission," I explained, watching the judge's ruddy complexion pale as he registered the federal seal. Alongside the docket, you will find the unredacted shadow ledgers for my brother's agricultural technology startup. Preston did not experience supply chain disruptions. He engaged in wire fraud. He funneled his investor seed capital through decentralized exchanges to feed a staggering offshore sports betting addiction. Preston let out a strangled gasp. He gripped the edges of his chair, his bloodshot eyes widening in sheer horror. The realization that his impenetrable secret was sitting on a courtroom table paralyzed him. His own wife audited the raw data dumps I continued delivering, the fatal blow to Preston's remaining sanity. Maya uncovered the theft. She discovered that Preston systematically drained the college savings accounts belonging to their twin daughters to cover his offshore margin calls. She delivered that hard drive to federal investigators yesterday morning, seeking total immunity. Patricia turned her head slowly, staring at her golden son. The horror radiating from her face was authentic. The pristine illusion of her brilliant tech founder boy evaporated, leaving a pathetic thief who stole from his own infants. "But Preston is only half of the liability equation," I said, shifting my focus back to my father. Thomas realized his son was facing federal indictment. He needed millions in rapid liquid capital to retain elite criminal defense counsel and float the failing startup. I extracted the secondary stack of papers from the briefcase, sliding the property tax manifests across the table. To raise that capital, Thomas secretly leveraged his own suburban mansion, I revealed. He took out a predatory commercial secondary mortgage using the family home as collateral. The interest rates are astronomical, and the principal balloon payment is due today. Patricia let out a sharp, ragged inhalation. She grabbed her husband's arm, her manicured fingernails digging into his expensive suit jacket. "Thomas," she whispered, the panic fracturing her voice. "Tell me that is a lie. Tell me you did not mortgage our home." Thomas ignored his wife. His gaze locked on the documents resting before the judge. The veins in his neck strained against his collar. The walls were closing in, crushing his elite facade into dust. I reached into the briefcase and pulled out the final stack of evidence. I placed the digital intrusion logs in the center of the table, ensuring the time-stamped IP addresses were clearly visible to everyone in the chamber. Because Thomas lacked the cash to satisfy the shadow lender, he needed a secondary asset to pledge against a new commercial bridge loan. I stated, connecting the final pieces of the conspiracy. He selected my wind farm. But he required my legal autonomy to secure the collateral. 3 nights ago, he executed a brute force cyber attack against my personal servers, attempting to hijack the administrative rights to my property deed. The sleazy guardian ad litem Douglas Mitchell shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He recognized the fatal trajectory of the conversation. I turned my attention directly toward the corrupt gatekeeper. During that cyber intrusion, Thomas downloaded a blank emergency medical proxy. I explained, my voice echoing in the silent room. He then paid a private psychiatrist to fabricate a diagnosis of rapid psychological decline, and he procured the signature of a compromised court-appointed official to validate the theft. Mitchell stood up, pushing his chair back. His self-preservation instincts overrode his loyalty to his golf partner. He realized the digital evidence resting on the table implicated him in a conspiracy to defraud a legal adult. A scandal of this magnitude would cost him his law license and potentially trigger criminal charges. He gathered his leather folio and stepped away from the table, severing his association with the Harrell family. Judge Lawson stared at the intrusion logs and the federal dockets. The informal, clubby atmosphere of the private hearing vanished entirely. He was a man who enjoyed the perks of his local elite status, but he was not willing to risk a federal investigation to protect a bankrupt country club friend. He pushed the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation away from his elbow, treating the paper like a toxic contaminant. Thomas recognized the shifting allegiance. The institutional machinery he had paid to control was actively abandoning him. The desperation finally breached his carefully constructed dam. He lost his mind. He lunged forward, planting both hands on the mahogany table. "Freeze her assets, Lawson," he screamed, his voice breaking into a ragged, frantic roar. "I do not care about the server logs. I do not care about the offshore accounts. You have to issue a temporary restraining order on the wind farm deed right now. The commercial bridge loan underwriters are waiting for the final conservatorship decree. If I do not pledge that land today, the bank will seize my estate by this afternoon. You have to freeze the parcel." The confession hung in the air. He had just admitted to a sitting judge that he intended to use a fraudulent conservatorship to steal an asset to cover his own personal debts. The mask was entirely gone. He was a drowning man begging for an anchor. I reached into the inner pocket of my charcoal suit jacket. I retrieved one final document folded neatly in thirds. The paper felt heavy, bearing the official seal of the federal government. I unfolded the page, smoothing the creases with deliberate precision. "You cannot freeze an asset that no longer resides in this jurisdiction," I stated. I slid the single sheet of paper across the table. It bypassed the high-priced litigator and came to a rest directly over the forged medical proxy in front of the judge. Judge Lawson picked up the document, adjusting his silver-framed reading glasses. The room fell into a deathly, suffocating silence. The only sound was the rustle of the heavy stock paper as the judge scanned the dense legal text. His eyes widened, registering the specific agricultural covenants and the permanent environmental protections outlined in the paragraphs. Lawson cleared his throat, his voice noticeably lacking its previous bureaucratic drone. "This is a finalized conservation easement," he read aloud, the words echoing like a death knell in the private chamber. The respondent executed a sweeping transfer of administration, bypassing the state registry entirely. The deed to the Western Wind Farm parcel was irrevocably transferred into a blind federal conservation trust. The mandatory holding period cleared this morning. The judge set the paper down, looking at Thomas with a mixture of pity and profound finality. "The Sedgwick County courts possess zero authority over federal environmental trusts," Lawson stated. "The asset is permanently shielded. The domestic estate balance is absolute zero." The mathematics of the reveal struck Thomas with the kinetic force of a freight train. He had already submitted the commercial bridge loan application to his banking underwriters. He had pledged the wind farm as collateral, guaranteeing the loan against an asset he believed he was about to steal. By collateralizing a property that was actively transitioning into a protected federal trust, he had committed verifiable federal wire fraud. The money he desperately needed to save his suburban mansion did not exist. The safety net he intended to rip from his daughter's hands had vanished into the untouchable ether of the federal government. Thomas collapses back into his chair, gasping for air, as he realizes the collateral he promised his banking creditors literally no longer exists. The air in Chamber 4B grew heavy and stagnant with the suffocating realization of total ruin. Thomas sat paralyzed in his leather chair. His chest hitched as he struggled to draw oxygen into his lungs. The fraudulent bridge loan he submitted to the commercial underwriters required verified collateral. He promised them a wind farm that now belonged to the federal government. The paperwork he signed yesterday was now a documented confession of wire fraud. Patricia looked at her husband, her manicured hands trembling over her designer handbag. The grim arithmetic finally settled into her mind. Without the bridge loan, they could not satisfy the balloon payment on the predatory secondary mortgage. The bank would seize the suburban estate. The country club luncheons, the charity galas, the pristine Midwestern social facade were all dead. Patricia let out a ragged, horrifying sob. The sound echoed off the wood-paneled walls, raw and stripped of any performative elegance. It was the sound of a woman watching her identity burn to ash. Preston realized his final lifeline had evaporated. The golden child turned his frantic, bloodshot eyes toward the parents who had spent his entire life shielding him from consequences. The realization that they possessed zero power to stop the Securities and Exchange Commission shattered his remaining sanity. He did not offer them comfort. He turned on them like a cornered rat. "You promised me," he shrieked, his voice cracking, pitching into a pathetic, hysterical register. You said you had this under control. You said the land was secured. You leveraged the house and you lost it. You are useless, both of you. You led me right into a federal indictment." He pointed a trembling finger at Thomas, his face twisting in a grotesque mask of betrayal. "You told me to hold off the investors. You told me the cash was coming. You are the reason I am going to prison." Thomas did not defend himself. He stared at the polished mahogany table, trapped in a catatonic state of shock. The high-priced litigator quietly slid his chair backward, gathering his files and avoiding eye contact with the imploding family. I remained seated, watching the hierarchy collapse. A faint, rhythmic vibration hummed from the pocket of my charcoal suit. I retrieved my phone, authenticating the screen. A notification from my auditing firm internal network illuminated the glass. I glanced at the data routing output, a cold, sterile satisfaction spreading through my chest. "Do you remember our Sunday dinner 6 months ago, Dad?" I asked, my voice cutting through Preston's chaotic shouting. I kept my tone even, requiring them to strain to hear me. "Do you remember the excuse I gave for refusing to sign your toxic bridge loan?" Thomas lifted his head, his eyes glazed and unfocused. I cited the strict debt-to-income compliance algorithms utilized by my auditing firm. I reminded him, the words falling like cold rain. Those algorithms do not just monitor employee portfolios. They interface with the regional banking networks to flag toxic commercial liabilities. When you submitted your bridge loan application claiming ownership of the wind farm, the underwriting software initiated a routine, automated compliance check against the Federal Property Registry. I set my phone face up on the table. "The federal conservation easement activated this morning, shielding the deed," I continued. "The moment the registry updated, the banking algorithm detected a critical collateral discrepancy. You attempted to borrow millions against an asset you do not legally possess. The system flagged the transaction as a high-risk, fraudulent anomaly." Thomas stared at the device, his skin turning a sickly shade of gray. "The automated compliance protocol does not wait for human intervention," I stated, delivering the final mathematical verdict. "It executes a mandatory defensive protocol. It just triggered a unilateral freeze on every corporate account registered to your holding company. Your operating capital is gone. The bank is preparing the foreclosure notices right now." The silence that followed carried the weight of a falling guillotine. The very compliance standards Thomas dismissed as a bureaucratic excuse had just functioned as the digital executioner terminating his financial existence. I reached out and gathered the time-stamped intrusion logs, the unredacted shadow ledgers, and the federal docket. I stacked the forensic evidence with meticulous precision, tapping the edges against the mahogany table. I placed the documents inside the charcoal leather briefcase. I closed the lid, pressing my thumbs against the brass latches. The twin clicks resonated in the silent chamber, signaling the end of the transaction. I stood up from the wooden chair, straightening the lapels of my suit jacket. I looked down at the architects of my misery. Thomas sat frozen, a hollow shell of patriarchal authority. Patricia wept into her hands, mourning her lost status. Preston rocked back and forth, muttering frantic, incoherent defenses to an empty room. I did not feel a sudden rush of adrenaline. I did not feel the need to hurl insults or demand apologies. For 28 years, they told me I would never measure up. They treated me as a disposable asset meant to subsidize their vanity. Standing over their ruined empire, I felt nothing but profound, unshakable peace. The ledger was balanced. The debt was settled. I turned and walked toward the heavy oak door. I did not look back. I stepped into the courthouse corridor, the ambient noise of the legal system washing over me. I walked out of the building and down the concrete steps, the cold Kansas wind offering a sharp, clarifying welcome. The structural collapse of a corrupted ecosystem occurs with staggering velocity once the foundational lies are exposed. The aftermath unfolded over the next few weeks, playing out across the public records and the local news cycle exactly as the audited data predicted. Without the bridge loan, Thomas could not satisfy the balloon payment on his predatory secondary mortgage. The shadow lenders showed zero mercy. The foreclosure process bypassed the standard delays, accelerating toward a rapid public seizure. The Sedgwick County Sheriff's Department arrived at the sprawling colonial estate on a Tuesday morning. The deputies escorted Thomas and Patricia Harrell out the front doors. They stood on the manicured lawn, watching the authorities place padlocks on the iron gates. The country club elite drove past the spectacle, averting their eyes and quarantining the Harrell name to protect their own reputations. Preston did not fare any better. The unredacted shadow ledger Maya handed over to the Securities and Exchange Commission provided a flawless roadmap of his offshore gambling and wire fraud. Federal marshals apprehended him in the parking lot of a budget motel on the outskirts of Kansas City. He was wearing the same wrinkled suit from the courthouse, his golden child persona, replaced by the stark reality of federal handcuffs. The authorities seized his remaining electronics and formally charged him with multiple counts of defrauding investors. The most satisfying consequence, however, emerged from the dormant architecture of the Federal Conservation Trust itself. When Valerie filed the easement to protect my wind farm, the federal environmental protections extended a strict bureaucratic radius around the designated acreage. Thomas owned 2 adjacent commercial parcels he intended to develop into a lucrative industrial logistics park. He had bet his remaining solvency on breaking ground by the spring. But the moment my land gained federal protected status, the Environmental Protection Agency initiated a mandatory ecological survey of the surrounding perimeter. The federal audit revealed his development plans threatened a protected watershed runoff zone attached to the conservation easement. The agency issued an immediate cease and desist order, paralyzing his commercial construction indefinitely. His remaining holding companies suffocated under an avalanche of federal red tape, rendering his last remaining real estate assets worthless. Autumn surrendered to the harsh arrival of the Midwestern winter. The sky above the western Kansas plains stretched into a vast, unbroken canopy of pale blue and crisp white clouds. I stood on the edge of the property, my boots planted firmly in the freezing soil. A mile in the distance, the towering white structures of the wind farm breached the horizon. The colossal blades turned in a steady, rhythmic cadence, harnessing the invisible momentum of the atmosphere. They generated endless, self-sustaining power, independent of fragile batteries or fraudulent seed capital. They possessed deep concrete roots, anchoring them permanently into the earth, weathering the brutal storms without faltering. The wind battered against my heavy wool coat, pulling at the fabric. The biting chill stung my cheeks, but I welcomed the sensation. The air tasted clean, devoid of the suffocating polite rot of the suburban dining room. I owned this land. I owned my future. I pulled the collar of my coat tight against my neck, listening to the low mechanical hum of the turbines, generating value in the distance. The toxic lineage was permanently severed. I stood on my own territory, my legacy secure, and my ledger forever balanced. The anatomy of a shattered facade. There is a specific haunting quiet that settles over a room when a family finally shatters. It doesn't sound like breaking glass, slammed doors, or the chaotic shouting of a sudden argument. It sounds like the rustle of a federal document sliding across a polished mahogany table. It sounds like the sudden, sharp intake of breath when parents realize the child they viewed as a disposable safety net has just stepped out of the way, letting them fall. The story of Dulcie Harrell and the catastrophic collapse of her family's suburban empire is not merely a tale of forensic revenge. At its very core, it is a devastating mirror held up to the modern American family, forcing us to confront the most uncomfortable corners of our own living rooms. American culture often sells a curated blueprint of success: sprawling estates, country club memberships, and children serving as perfectly polished trophies. Thomas and Patricia Harrell constructed a pristine facade of Midwestern royalty, projecting an image of unshakable prosperity. But beneath the velvet dinner jackets and charity luncheon whispers, their foundation was rotting. They did not build a home grounded in unconditional support. They built a transactional enterprise driven by vanity. The cost of transactional love. When we examine the profound moral decay within the Harrell household, we uncover a terrifying distortion of traditional family responsibility. The most fundamental duty of any parent is to provide long-term guidance rooted in honesty, fairness, and deep emotional awareness. A home should function as a sanctuary where children are nurtured to become independent, morally grounded, and resilient adults. Instead, Thomas and Patricia transformed their family hierarchy into a ruthless balance sheet. They viewed their children not as human beings, but as financial instruments to be leveraged, manipulated, and ultimately liquidated to preserve their social standing. This transactional approach to parenting manifests most tragically in the creation of the golden child. Preston Harrell was given every conceivable advantage, shielded from consequences, and endlessly praised for unearned potential. His parents equated love with relentless financial appeasement. When his hollow business ventures bled cash, they secretly mortgaged their shelter to keep his illusion alive, shielding him from the harsh friction of reality. We often mistake this suffocating rescue for profound parental devotion, but it is a massive failure of emotional awareness. By constantly absorbing the impact of Preston's catastrophic choices, his parents robbed him of the opportunity to develop character. Genuine fairness in parenting requires the courage to let a child fall. It requires the fortitude to teach them strict accountability and the wisdom to guide them through the difficult grace of standing back up on their own. Shielding a child from reality cripples their psychological development. Preston's eventual descent into federal fraud, desperate gambling, and stealing from his own infant daughters was not an anomaly. It was the inevitable harvest of the toxic seeds his parents spent decades planting. The burden of the invisible workhorse. On the opposite end of this toxic ledger stood Dulcie. If Preston was the fragile idol meant to be worshipped, Dulcie was the invisible workhorse expected to pull the plow. She possessed the grit, clinical intelligence, and unyielding resilience that her parents completely lacked. Yet instead of celebrating her competence, they weaponized her strength against her. Because she could navigate complex audits and required zero maintenance, they deemed her robust enough to absorb the family's total financial destruction. This is a quiet, insidious form of emotional abuse that thrives in many traditional family structures. Parents who lack emotional awareness often punish their most capable children by demanding they carry the heavy burdens the rest of the family outright refuses to shoulder. Dulcie's parents expected her to sacrifice her grandmother's legacy and her fundamental legal autonomy to save a brother who possessed zero integrity. They demanded absolute loyalty, but they offered only exploitation and betrayal in return. Dulcie's ultimate triumph wasn't merely securing her wind farm. Her true, lasting victory was severing the generational curse. She looked at the toxic lineage of women in her family who were historically forced to act as shock absorbers for the failures of arrogant men, and she finally said, "No more." She demonstrated that biology is not a binding financial contract. You can love your family, but you have zero obligation to fund their self-destruction. Reclaiming your ledger. These invisible ledgers and silent battles exist in millions of households. They happen behind closed doors in affluent gated suburbs and working-class neighborhoods alike. If you have ever been measured by what you could provide rather than who you are not alone. We share these blueprints of survival because truth is the most powerful weapon against manipulation. If Dulcie's quiet strength and unyielding boundaries resonated with you, I invite you to join our growing community. Subscribe and follow the Linda Vengeance channel. Here, we dissect the intricate narratives that unfold when the polite masks slip, exploring the unspoken boundaries and the hard-won victories that define our closest relationships. Leave a comment below sharing your own experiences. Your voice matters in this space. A question for the quiet hours. As the dust finally settles on the Harrell family's total ruin, we are left sitting in a lingering, uncomfortable silence. The story of a daughter walking away from her bankrupt, deceitful parents into the freezing Kansas wind feels definitive, but the echoes of that departure continue to reverberate. It asks us to turn our gaze inward, peeling back the layers of our own domestic lives. Parenting is a fragile, terrifying endeavor. We all want to provide security for our children and desperately want them to succeed. But the line between unconditionally supporting a child and actively enabling their destruction is often blurred by our own egos. When examining the dynamics within our families, we must ask what currency we are truly trading in. Are we teaching our children the enduring value of honest labor, emotional intelligence, and personal accountability? Or are we silently demanding they validate our own unfulfilled ambitions and mask our deepest insecurities? When the performative curtain falls, the curated aesthetic of your home means absolutely nothing. The leased luxury cars in the driveway and the prestige of your job title cannot repair a fractured soul. What remains is the raw, undeniable truth of how you treated the people who depended on your guidance. Did you nurture their fierce independence, or did you attempt to possess and control their futures? Dulcie Harrell audited her family and found them entirely bankrupt of morality. She closed the toxic account and walked into a clean, unburdened tomorrow. But as you process this story and look around the quiet, familiar rooms of your own house, a heavy shadow of a question remains suspended in the air. Look closely at the faces of the people you claim to love. Look at the unspoken expectations you place upon their shoulders and the sacrifices you have silently demanded they make in the name of familial loyalty. If a forensic auditor were to examine the foundation of your family tonight, digging past the polite smiles, the holiday photographs, and the comfortable lies, what kind of ledger would they find?